Welcome, weary travelers, to a tale of warmth and loyalty that spans 1,000 years. Tonight, we journey through the complete history of Hufflepuff House, from its humble origins in ancient Wales to its enduring legacy within Hogwarts' hallowed halls. Here you will find no grand battles or dramatic conquests, but something rarer and more precious, the quiet strength of those who choose kindness over glory, patience over pride. As you settle into comfort, let these words carry you through generations of badgers who proved that the greatest magic lies not in power, but in the bonds we forge with one another. In the misted valleys of ancient Wales, where the earth itself seemed to hum with forgotten magic, and the stones remembered songs older than written history, there once flourished a family whose very name would echo through 1,000 years of wizarding lore. The Hufflepuffs were not the most prominent of magical bloodlines, nor did they seek the spotlight that drew other families into the chronicles of power and politics. Instead, they were the quiet keepers of older ways, the patient tenders of magics that required not brilliance but devotion, not conquest but cultivation. Their estate lay nestled in a valley where 3 rivers converged, creating a natural amphitheater of rolling hills that caught the morning mist and held it like a blessing. The land itself was alive with what the family called Earth Song, the deep, thrumming magic that flowed through soil and root, stone and stream. Here, for generations uncounted, the Hufflepuffs had practiced their particular brand of magic, one that worked in harmony with the natural world rather than seeking to dominate it. The family's gifts were subtle but profound. They could coax plants to grow in barren soil, persuade injured creatures to trust their healing touch, and brew potions that didn't merely cure ailments but restored the fundamental balance that allowed true health to flourish. Their magic was patient magic, the kind that understood that the most powerful transformations happened slowly, like the changing of seasons or the gradual wearing of water on stone. At the heart of their estate stood a manor house built from local grey stone, its walls thick enough to withstand both winter storms and more supernatural threats. The architecture was functional rather than grand, designed by people who understood that true security came not from impressive towers but from solid foundations and well-planned defenses. Every room had multiple exits, every window could be quickly shuttered, and throughout the structure ran hidden passages that allowed the family to move unseen should enemies breach their outer defenses. But it was the gardens that truly revealed the Hufflepuff character. Sprawling across acres of carefully tended ground, they contained not just the expected herbs and vegetables, but also plants so rare that their seeds were traded like precious gems among those who knew their value. There were healing herbs that grew nowhere else in Britain, flowering vines that could detect poison in the air, and ancient trees whose bark held protective properties that had been carefully cultivated over centuries. The family's approach to magic was fundamentally different from their more famous contemporaries. Where other bloodlines sought to expand their power through conquest or political maneuvering, the Hufflepuffs focused on deepening their understanding of the natural world and their place within it. They studied the migration patterns of magical creatures, learned to read weather signs that could predict not just storms but magical disturbances, and developed techniques for growing plants that could thrive in conditions that should have been impossible. Their magical library, housed in the manor's eastern wing, contained texts that were utterly unique in the wizarding world. Instead of the typical grimoires filled with offensive spells and dark enchantments, their collection focused on healing arts, agricultural magic, and the complex relationships between different forms of magical life. Many of the books were written by family members themselves, careful records of experiments and discoveries that built upon each other across generations. The current head of the family, a wizard named Cadwallon Hufflepuff, embodied all the virtues his bloodline had cultivated over centuries. He was a man of middle years, with the weathered hands of someone who worked his own soil and the patient eyes of someone who understood that the most important magics took time to mature. His wife, Morwenna, shared his gifts and his philosophy, and together they had created something rare in the wizarding world of their time, a household where magic served life rather than dominating it. Their children, including young Helga, who would one day carry their name into legend, grew up surrounded by this philosophy of magical stewardship. They learned early that power without wisdom was destruction, that the strongest magic was often the gentlest, and that true strength lay not in what you could force the world to become, but in what you could help it discover about itself. The family's reputation among their neighbors was that of healers and wise counselors, people to whom others turned when conventional magic failed, or when problems required solutions that went deeper than mere spell work. They were known to take in orphaned magical creatures, to offer sanctuary to those fleeing persecution, and to share their knowledge freely with anyone who approached them with genuine need and honest intentions. But this very generosity, this openness that would later define Helga's own character, also made them vulnerable to those who saw kindness as weakness and sharing as an opportunity for exploitation. The magical world of the 10th century was not a peaceful place. Dark wizards roamed the countryside seeking artifacts to steal and bloodlines to corrupt. Ancient feuds between magical families could erupt into violence that devastated entire regions. And always there was the growing tension between magical and non-magical peoples, a division that would shape the wizarding world for centuries to come. The Hufflepuff family had always tried to remain above such conflicts, believing that their duty was to preserve and protect rather than to fight and conquer. They maintained careful neutrality in political disputes, offered healing to both sides in magical conflicts, and focused their attention on the long-term work of keeping ancient knowledge alive for future generations. This approach had served them well for centuries, allowing them to accumulate wisdom and magical artifacts while avoiding the disasters that befell more aggressive families. Chief among their treasures was a golden cup that had been in the family for longer than anyone could remember. Family legends claimed it had been crafted by the first Hufflepuff wizard, using techniques that had been lost to time and materials that no longer existed in the natural world. The cup itself was beautiful but not ostentatious, its golden surface warm to the touch and decorated with engravings so subtle they seemed to shift in the light like living things. But the cup's true value lay not in its appearance but in its magical properties. It was said to be one of the few artifacts that could violate what would later be known as Gamp's law of elemental transfiguration, capable of creating genuine nourishment from nothing and of providing exactly what its holder needed most at any given moment. More than that, it seemed to respond to the moral character of those who wielded it, growing warm in the hands of those whose intentions were pure and remaining cold to those who sought to use its power for selfish ends. The cup had been passed down through generations of Hufflepuff family heads, each one adding their own protective enchantments and deepening their understanding of its capabilities. It was not merely a magical tool, but a repository of the family's collective wisdom, containing memories and knowledge that could be accessed by those deemed worthy of its trust. In many ways, it was the heart of the Hufflepuff legacy, the physical embodiment of everything the family represented. Cadwallon understood the responsibility that came with guardianship of such an artifact. He had spent years learning to work with the cup's magic, not seeking to master it, but to understand his place within its larger purpose. Under his care, the cup had been used to feed the hungry during harsh winters, to provide healing draughts that saved lives throughout the valley, and to create moments of fellowship that brought together people who might otherwise have remained strangers or enemies. The family's magical practices were deeply intertwined with their care for the cup and their understanding of its significance. They had developed rituals that honored both the artifact and the responsibilities it represented, ceremonies that connected them to previous generations while preparing them for the challenges that lay ahead. These practices were not just magical but spiritual, recognizing that true power came from understanding one's place in the larger web of existence rather than from dominating others or accumulating personal advantages. Their estate became a place of pilgrimage for those seeking wisdom about the deeper aspects of magic. Young witches and wizards came to learn about herbology and healing, but they left with something more valuable, an understanding of how magic could serve purposes larger than personal ambition. The Hufflepuffs were generous teachers, sharing their knowledge freely with anyone who approached them with sincere intentions and genuine respect for the natural world. But this very openness, this willingness to trust and to share, contained within it the seeds of the family's destruction. There were those in the magical world who saw the Hufflepuffs' treasures and knowledge as prizes to be won, rather than gifts to be cherished. Dark wizards who had heard whispers of the Golden Cup and its impossible powers began to take interest in the quiet family in the Welsh Valley. Political tensions that the Hufflepuffs had tried to avoid were drawing closer to their sanctuary, bringing with them choices that no amount of wisdom or preparation could make easier. The signs of coming trouble were subtle at first: unusual disturbances in the magical creatures that lived on their lands, reports of dark wizards gathering in nearby regions, and an increase in the number of desperate refugees seeking sanctuary at their gates. Cadwallon and Morwenna recognized these portents for what they were, understanding that their long peace was drawing to a close, and that they would soon face challenges that would test everything their family had built over centuries of patient cultivation. They began to make preparations, not for war, but for preservation. The most precious artifacts were hidden in secret vaults protected by enchantments that would take lifetimes to unravel. The rarest plants were transplanted to concealed gardens scattered throughout the valley. Most importantly, arrangements were made to ensure that the family's knowledge would survive even if the family itself did not, with copies of their most important texts sent to trusted allies in distant lands. The Golden Cup, however, could not be hidden away like other treasures. Its magic was too deeply connected to the family's daily life, too essential to their role as healers and protectors of their community. Moreover, the cup itself seemed to resist attempts to separate it from its proper guardians, growing cold and lifeless when handled by anyone other than direct members of the Hufflepuff bloodline. It was both their greatest treasure and their greatest vulnerability, the very thing that made them invaluable to their allies and irresistible to their enemies. As the 10th century drew toward its close, the magical world was changing in ways that would reshape the very nature of wizarding society. Ancient alliances were crumbling under the pressure of new conflicts, and the old ways of life that families like the Hufflepuffs represented were increasingly seen as obstacles to progress rather than treasures to be preserved. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of one family, but the future direction of magical civilization itself. In their quiet valley, surrounded by their gardens and their books, their healing herbs and their protective enchantments, the Hufflepuffs continued their work of tending and preserving, teaching and healing. They knew that darkness was gathering on the horizon, but they faced it with the same patience and wisdom that had guided their family for countless generations. They understood that some things were worth preserving regardless of the cost, and that sometimes the most important victories were won not through conquest, but through the simple act of refusing to abandon one's principles in the face of overwhelming opposition. The last golden summer of the Hufflepuff family was drawing to a close, though they could not yet know that their peaceful existence was measured in months rather than years. Soon their valley would echo with sounds it had never heard before, the crash of hostile magic, and the cries of those who sought to destroy everything the family had spent centuries creating. But that darkness lay yet in the future, and for now, the Earth Song continued to flow through their lands, carrying with it the promise that even if the singers were silenced, the song itself would find new voices to carry it forward into whatever future awaited the magical world. In the shadow of mountains that touched the grey Welsh sky like gnarled fingers reaching toward forgotten gods, there stood a cottage that seemed to have grown from the earth itself rather than being built by human hands. Its walls were thick stone mortared with clay from the valley floor, its roof heavy with slate that had been quarried from the same hills that sheltered it. Smoke rose constantly from its chimney, not just from the necessity of warmth, but because the man who dwelt within understood that a cold hearth was an invitation to darker things than mere winter chill. This was the home of Morwen the Grim, a wizard whose reputation extended far beyond the borders of his secluded valley. He was not grim by nature, though the years had carved lines of caution deep into his weathered face, but rather by necessity. The world beyond his threshold was filled with dangers that required constant vigilance, threats that could not be dismissed with optimism or overcome through wishful thinking. Morwen had survived longer than most of his contemporaries precisely because he understood that preparedness was not paranoia but wisdom, that assuming the worst of strangers was not cruelty but common sense. His cottage reflected this philosophy in every carefully planned detail. The windows were small and high, difficult to breach but positioned to provide excellent fields of observation. The single door was reinforced with iron bands and protected by wards that would make unauthorized entry extremely unpleasant for anyone foolish enough to attempt it. Even the garden, with its neat rows of herbs and vegetables, was arranged to provide clear sight lines in all directions while offering multiple concealed paths that would allow rapid escape if circumstances demanded it. It was into this fortress of solitude that fate had brought a child, barely more than an infant when she arrived, found nestled in the roots of an ancient ash tree after a night of storms that had shaken the very foundations of the mountains. She had been wrapped in rough wool that spoke of hurried flight rather than careful preparation, her tiny fist clutched around something that gleamed even in the dim light of dawn. Morwen had discovered her there during his morning survey of the protective wards that surrounded his territory, drawn by disturbances in the magical patterns that suggested something significant had occurred during the night. The child was clearly magical. That much was evident from the way small objects near her seemed to rearrange themselves without cause, and from the unusual warmth that surrounded her despite the cool morning air. But more than that, there was something about her presence that seemed to calm the very landscape itself. Birds that had been frightened by the previous night's storm settled peacefully in the branches above her, and even the usually skittish deer ventured close enough to investigate this strange addition to their domain. Morwen was not a man given to sentiment or impulse, but something about the child's situation touched a part of his nature that he had thought buried beneath years of necessary hardness. Perhaps it was the way she looked at him without fear, her dark eyes serious beyond her years, but holding none of the wariness that most people developed after encountering him. Or perhaps it was the simple recognition that she, like him, was alone in a world that could be cruel to those who did not fit its expectations of what magical people should be. He named her Helga, after his own grandmother who had possessed the rare gift of making even the most suspicious strangers feel welcome at her table. It seemed appropriate for a child who had arrived with nothing but mystery, and yet somehow made his austere cottage feel more like a home than it had in decades. She grew up in this environment of careful preparation and constant awareness, learning from her earliest years that survival required both magical skill and practical wisdom. Morwen's approach to her education was methodical and comprehensive, though tempered by a gentleness that would have surprised those who knew only his public reputation. He understood that she was not merely his ward but potentially something far more significant, a child whose very presence seemed to resonate with ancient magics that he could sense but not fully comprehend. The golden cup she had carried with her was clearly an artifact of considerable power, though its true nature remained hidden behind enchantments that would yield their secrets only to one deemed worthy of such knowledge. Her magical education began with the fundamentals that all wizarding children must master: the careful control of accidental magic, the basic principles that governed spellcasting, and the mental discipline required to channel magical energy safely and effectively. But Morwen's teaching went far beyond these basics, encompassing survival skills that most children of magical families never needed to learn. She was taught to identify the signs of hostile magic, to recognize when someone was lying or concealing their true intentions, and to defend herself using methods that did not rely solely on magical power. The spell that became her signature, learned through countless hours of practice in the cottage's stone-walled cellar, was Expelliarmus, the disarming charm that could end conflicts without causing permanent harm. Morwen insisted that she practice this spell until it became as natural as breathing, until she could cast it perfectly even when startled from sleep or distracted by other concerns. His reasoning was both practical and philosophical. In a world where magical conflicts could escalate quickly to lethal violence, the ability to end a fight by removing an opponent's weapon was infinitely more valuable than mastering a dozen offensive curses. Day after day, she would stand in the cellar's dim light, her small wand moving in the precise motions that Morwen had demonstrated, speaking the incantation with increasing confidence until the spell flowed from her wand with the inevitability of water flowing downhill. He would attack her with practice wands, coming from different angles and at unexpected moments, teaching her to respond instinctively rather than relying on conscious thought that might be too slow when her life depended on quick action. But it was not from Morwen alone that she learned the lessons that would shape her character. The cottage's other inhabitant, a house elf named Twilin, provided education of a different but equally important kind. Twilin had served Morwen's family for generations, bound by ancient magic but motivated by genuine affection for those under his care. He was a master of domestic magic in all its forms, from the complex alchemy of cooking to the subtle arts of household protection and comfort. Under Twilin's patient guidance, young Helga learned that magic was not just about power and conflict, but about the countless small ways that magical skill could make life better for everyone who shared the same space. She learned to brew healing potions that could ease pain and speed recovery from injury, to prepare foods that were not just nourishing but actively beneficial to health and magical development, and to create an atmosphere of warmth and welcome that went far beyond mere hospitality. The kitchen became her favorite classroom, a place where the measured addition of ingredients and the careful timing of magical processes taught her patience and precision in ways that formal spellwork never could. Twilin's recipes were not just collections of ingredients, but lessons in understanding how different magical elements could work together to create effects greater than the sum of their parts. A simple healing broth required not just the right herbs, but an understanding of how their magical properties would interact, how the phases of the moon would affect their potency, and how the cook's own emotional state would influence the final result. More than technique, Twilin taught her the philosophy that would define her approach to magic throughout her life, the understanding that true magical skill lay not in dominating the world around you, but in working harmoniously with its natural patterns and tendencies. The best meals were not forced into existence through overwhelming magical power, but coaxed into being through gentle encouragement of natural processes. The most effective healing potions were those that supported the body's own capacity for recovery, rather than replacing its functions with artificial magical effects. Through Twilin's example, she learned that service was not servitude when it was freely given and motivated by genuine care for others. The house elf took obvious pride in his work, finding satisfaction in tasks that others might consider menial but which he understood as essential to creating an environment where those under his care could thrive. His magic was quiet and subtle, but absolutely essential, the kind of power that made everything else possible without calling attention to itself. The contrast between her two teachers shaped Helga's understanding of magic in ways that would influence every decision she made in later life. From Morwen, she learned that the world contained real dangers that required practical responses, that kindness without the ability to defend it was ultimately useless, and that true strength often required making difficult choices that others would not understand or appreciate. From Twilyn, she learned that the greatest magic was often the most humble, that creating comfort and healing was more valuable than winning battles, and that true power lay in lifting others up rather than tearing them down. Her childhood passed quietly in this environment of careful learning and gradual growth, marked not by the dramatic events that shaped the lives of more prominent magical families, but by the steady accumulation of skills and wisdom that would serve her throughout her life. She learned to read the weather signs that could predict not just storms but magical disturbances, to identify plants that could heal or harm based on subtle differences in their magical signatures, and to sense the emotional states of those around her through techniques that went beyond normal human perception. The golden cup that had accompanied her arrival remained a mystery throughout these early years, though its presence was a constant reminder that she was more than just an orphaned child who had been taken in by a solitary wizard. Morwen allowed her to handle the cup occasionally, always under his careful supervision, but its true powers remained dormant, and its secrets locked away behind enchantments that would not yield to childhood curiosity or amateur investigation. Sometimes, when she held the cup while helping Twilyn prepare meals, she would feel a warmth that seemed to flow from the artifact into the food they were preparing, making even simple ingredients taste somehow richer and more satisfying than they should have been. Other times, when someone arrived at their door seeking healing or shelter, the cup would seem to pulse with gentle light, and whatever aid they provided would prove more effective than their skills alone should have made possible. These experiences taught her to respect the cup not as a tool to be used, but as a partner whose cooperation had to be earned through worthy intentions and selfless actions. She understood, even without fully comprehending the implications, that she was the inheritor of something precious and powerful, something that carried with it responsibilities that extended far beyond her own personal welfare or advancement. As she grew from child to young woman, the peaceful rhythm of their isolated life began to show signs of strain. Reports filtered in from the outside world of increasing conflicts between magical communities, of dark wizards gathering power and seeking ancient artifacts for purposes that promised nothing good for anyone who opposed them. Morwen's natural caution deepened into something approaching obsession, as he recognized that their sanctuary could not remain hidden forever from those who sought what they protected. The girl who had once been content to spend her days learning domestic magic and defensive spells began to feel the stirrings of something larger, a sense that her life was meant to serve purposes beyond the comfortable boundaries of their valley refuge. She found herself studying the maps in Morwen's small library, wondering what lay beyond the mountains that had always defined the limits of her world. She began to ask questions about her origins that had never seemed important before, seeking to understand not just who her parents had been, but what they had died trying to protect. Morwen's answers were careful and incomplete, revealing just enough to satisfy her immediate curiosity while concealing the larger truths that he felt she was not yet ready to understand. He spoke of a family that had been known for their wisdom and generosity, who had made enemies not through any evil they had done, but simply because they possessed something that others coveted. He told her that the cup she carried was the last remnant of their legacy, a responsibility that would one day require her to make choices that would define not just her own fate, but the future of the magical world itself. These conversations took place in the quiet hours after dinner, when the day's work was done and the cottage's protective wards hummed with the energy needed to maintain their concealment from hostile eyes. Morwen would sit in his favorite chair near the fire, his weathered hands wrapped around a mug of the herbal tea that Twilyn brewed to ease the aches that came with age and accumulated magical strain. Helga would curl up on the hearth rug, the golden cup cradled in her lap, listening to fragments of history that painted pictures of a world far more complex and dangerous than the simple life she had always known. The knowledge that she was the inheritor of some ancient conflict, that her very existence made her a target for enemies she had never met, should have frightened her. Instead, she found herself feeling a strange sense of relief at finally understanding why her guardian had always been so careful, why their cottage was protected by so many layers of defensive magic, and why Morwen sometimes spent entire nights standing watch at the windows while she slept peacefully in her bed. The revelation of her true heritage began to change her relationship with the magic she had been learning. Spells that had once seemed like interesting academic exercises now took on urgent practical importance. The Expelliarmus charm that Morwen had insisted she practice became not just a useful technique, but a potential lifeline in situations where her survival might depend on her ability to end conflicts quickly and decisively. The healing potions she brewed with Twillin's guidance were not just expressions of academic interest, but preparations for a future where she might need to tend wounds inflicted by enemies who would show no mercy to anyone associated with her family's legacy. But perhaps the most significant change was in her relationship with the Golden Cup itself. As her understanding of its importance grew, she began to sense that it was not merely a passive artifact, but something that was actively aware of her development and responsive to her growing maturity. The cup seemed to warm in her hands when she made choices that aligned with her family's values of protection and service, and to grow cold when she considered actions that would serve only her own interests at the expense of others. This feedback was subtle but unmistakable, a constant gentle guidance that helped her understand what it meant to be worthy of the responsibility she had inherited. The cup was not just a tool of great power, but a teacher that would help her learn how to use that power wisely, and more importantly, when not to use it at all. Through this relationship, she began to develop the moral compass that would guide her throughout her life, the understanding that true strength lay not in the ability to impose your will on others, but in the wisdom to know when such imposition was truly necessary, and when it was merely an expression of personal pride or ambition. The quiet years of her education in Morwen's cottage were drawing to a close, though none of them yet realized how dramatically their peaceful existence was about to change. Forces were stirring in the wider magical world that would soon reach even into their remote valley, bringing with them choices that would test everything she had learned about magic, morality, and the price of standing up for principles that others might not understand or share. The child who had arrived as a helpless infant, carrying nothing but mystery and a golden cup, had grown into a young woman whose abilities and character marked her as someone significant. She was not yet the legendary founder who would one day help establish the greatest school of magic the world had ever known, but the foundation for that future had been laid in the careful lessons of her guardians and the patient wisdom of the artifact that had chosen her as its bearer. Soon, very soon, that foundation would be tested by fire and darkness, and the world would discover whether the gentle magic of the Hufflepuff legacy was strong enough to survive in a time when gentleness was increasingly seen as weakness and kindness was mistaken for vulnerability. The true measure of her heritage was about to be revealed, not through conquest or domination, but through the far more difficult challenge of maintaining compassion in the face of cruelty and holding fast to principles of inclusion and service, when the easier path would be to abandon such ideals for the sake of personal survival. The morning when Helga Hufflepuff finally left the valley that had sheltered her childhood was marked by mist so thick it seemed the very mountains were weeping for her departure. She stood at the threshold of Morwen's cottage, the golden cup secured in a leather satchel that Twillin had crafted with his own hands, its surface protected by enchantments that would keep it hidden from casual observation while allowing its magic to flow freely when needed. The house elf pressed a bundle of provisions into her arms, his ancient eyes bright with unshed tears as he whispered blessings in the old tongue that his people had spoken before they were bound to wizarding service. Morwen himself stood silent in the doorway, his weathered face betraying none of the emotion that Helga could sense radiating from his magical core like heat from banked coals. He had taught her everything he could about survival and defense, about reading the intentions of strangers and recognizing danger before it could manifest as action. But now she was venturing into a world where book learning and controlled practice would give way to real threats and genuine consequences, where the mistakes of youth might be paid for with more than temporary embarrassment or minor injury. The path she chose led northward through passes that had been carved by glaciers in ages past, following trade routes that connected the isolated valleys of Wales to the broader world of medieval Britain. Her journey was necessarily slow and cautious, as a young woman traveling alone attracted attention that could range from merely unwelcome to actively dangerous. She had learned from Morwen to trust her instincts about people, to recognize the subtle signs that marked predators from protectors, but theory was proving quite different from practice when applied to real strangers with unknown motivations. Her first weeks of travel were marked by encounters that tested both her magical skills and her judgment of character. There were merchants who offered passage in their wagons but whose eyes lingered too long on her possessions, innkeepers who seemed helpful but asked too many questions about her destination and companions, and fellow travelers who appeared friendly but whose magical signatures carried traces of dark enchantments that suggested involvement in activities she preferred not to investigate too closely. But there were also genuine kindnesses from unexpected sources, a family of farmers who shared their simple meal without asking for payment or explanation, a village healer who treated a minor injury without expecting anything in return, and an elderly wizard who offered magical instruction in exchange for help tending his garden. These encounters taught her that the world contained both more danger and more goodness than her sheltered upbringing had prepared her to expect, and that the skill of distinguishing between the two was perhaps the most valuable lesson she could master. The cup she carried proved to be both blessing and burden during these early travels. Its magic was subtle, but unmistakable to those who knew what to look for, providing exactly what was needed most in difficult situations: clean water when natural sources were contaminated, nourishing food when supplies ran low, and healing drafts when illness or injury threatened to end her journey permanently. But its power also attracted attention from those who sensed its presence without understanding its nature, marking her as someone significant enough to be worth robbing or following or questioning about matters she was not prepared to discuss. She learned to conceal the cup's influence through techniques that Morwen had taught her, making its miraculous provisions appear to come from natural sources or her own careful preparation. A meal that had been enhanced by the cup's magic would be presented as the result of particularly good ingredients and skilled cooking. Water that had been purified by its power would seem to come from a naturally clean spring that she had been fortunate enough to discover. Healing that had been accelerated by its influence would be attributed to effective herbal remedies and careful tending of wounds. These deceptions were not comfortable for someone whose nature inclined toward honesty and openness, but she understood that revealing the cup's true capabilities would bring attention that could end her journey before it had truly begun. There were forces in the medieval world that sought such artifacts for purposes that had nothing to do with the healing and nurturing that had defined her family's legacy, and she was not yet ready to face enemies who would stop at nothing to claim what she carried. The landscape through which she traveled was itself a constant education in the diversity of magical practice and the varying relationships between wizarding and non-magical communities. In some regions, magical folk lived openly among their muggle neighbors, their abilities seen as useful gifts that benefited the entire community. In others, wizards and witches remained carefully hidden, emerging only when their help was desperately needed and disappearing again before questions could be asked about the source of their seemingly miraculous interventions. She observed the different approaches to magic that characterized various regions and communities, noting how geography and local culture influenced the development of magical traditions. Mountain communities tended to favor earth magic and the manipulation of stone and metal, while coastal areas had developed sophisticated water magic and techniques for working with weather patterns. Forest dwellers had created elaborate systems of plant magic and communication with woodland creatures, while those who lived in open grasslands had mastered air magic and the art of long-distance travel through magical means. Each new magical tradition she encountered added to her understanding of the broader principles that governed all magical practice, while also revealing the limitations of the narrow focus she had learned from Morwen and Twilin. Her guardians had taught her well within their areas of expertise, but they had necessarily been limited by their own experiences and the particular threats they had faced during their lifetimes. The wider world contained forms of magic and approaches to problem-solving that neither of them had ever encountered, techniques that could prove invaluable in the challenges that lay ahead. It was during the harsh grip of winter, when even the hardiest travelers sought shelter from storms that could kill the unprepared, that she encountered the person who would become not just her closest friend but her partner in the great work that would define both their lives. The meeting took place in a cave high in the Scottish Highlands, where she had taken refuge from a blizzard that had caught her unprepared despite all her careful attention to weather signs and seasonal patterns. The cave was larger than it had appeared from outside, carved by water and wind into chambers that provided both shelter and defense from anyone who might seek to take advantage of a stranded traveler. She had been grateful to find it empty of dangerous wildlife or hostile inhabitants, but as she worked to build a fire from the damp wood she carried in her pack, she became aware that she was not alone in the cave after all. The other occupant was a young woman of approximately her own age, though clearly from a very different background and magical tradition. Where Helga's clothing was practical and designed for travel, this stranger wore robes that spoke of wealth and education, garments that had been crafted by skilled hands from materials that were both beautiful and magically enhanced. Her dark hair was arranged in a style that suggested noble birth, and her bearing carried the confidence of someone who had never needed to question her place in the world or her right to respect and consideration from others. But it was not her appearance that marked this stranger as significant. It was the quality of her magical presence, a complex signature that spoke of abilities far beyond what Helga had encountered in any of her previous meetings with other magical practitioners. This was someone who had been trained not just in the practical applications of magic, but in its theoretical foundations. Someone who understood the underlying principles that governed magical phenomena, rather than simply knowing how to achieve specific effects through rote memorization of spells and procedures. The stranger was clearly in distress, though she attempted to conceal her condition through the kind of stoic composure that suggested extensive training in maintaining appearances, regardless of personal circumstances. She was cold and exhausted from her own struggle against the storm, but more than that, she carried signs of magical depletion that indicated she had recently been forced to use her abilities far beyond normal limits. Whatever had brought her to this remote cave had required magical effort that had pushed her to the edge of collapse, and she was in need of assistance whether she was willing to admit it or not. Helga's response was immediate and instinctive, shaped by years of learning from Twilin that true strength lay in caring for others regardless of any personal advantage such care might provide. She shared her fire and her meager supplies without hesitation, offering warmth and food to someone who was clearly in greater need than herself. The soup she prepared was enhanced by the cup's subtle magic, providing nourishment that went beyond simple calories to restore both physical strength and magical energy, though she was careful to make the meal appear to be nothing more than the result of good ingredients and careful preparation. The stranger accepted her hospitality with a mixture of gratitude and wariness that spoke of a lifetime spent learning to evaluate the motivations of others and to be suspicious of kindness that came without obvious strings attached. She introduced herself as Rowena, a name that carried weight in certain circles, though it meant nothing to Helga at the time. Only later would she learn that her companion was already establishing a reputation as one of the most brilliant magical theorists of their generation. Someone whose insights into the fundamental nature of magic were beginning to influence practitioners throughout Britain and beyond. Their initial conversation was careful and formal, each woman evaluating the other through techniques that had been learned in very different schools but served similar purposes. Rowena was clearly accustomed to dealing with people who might seek to exploit any perceived weakness or advantage, while Helga had been trained to recognize potential threats and respond accordingly. But beneath this mutual caution, there was also a recognition of shared qualities that neither of them had encountered in their previous interactions with other magical practitioners. Both women possessed a seriousness of purpose that went beyond personal ambition or the simple desire for magical power. They were driven by goals that extended beyond their own welfare, motivated by visions of what the magical world could become rather than satisfaction with what it currently was. This shared idealism, combined with complementary areas of expertise and experience, formed the foundation for a friendship that would endure through challenges that would test every aspect of their characters and abilities. As the storm raged outside their refuge, they talked through the long hours of darkness about subjects that revealed the depth and breadth of their respective educations and experiences. Rowena spoke of her studies into the theoretical foundations of magic, her attempts to understand the underlying principles that governed all magical phenomena rather than simply mastering specific applications. Helga shared her own knowledge of practical magic and its application to healing and nurturing, explaining techniques that had been passed down through generations of her family but were unknown to formal magical education. Their conversation revealed that each possessed knowledge that complemented the other's areas of expertise, creating possibilities for collaboration that neither could achieve alone. Rowena's theoretical understanding could provide explanations for magical phenomena that Helga had observed but never fully comprehended, while Helga's practical experience could test and refine theories that Rowena had developed through study and contemplation but never applied in real-world situations. More importantly, they discovered that they shared a vision of what magical education could become if it were freed from the limitations and prejudices that currently defined it. Both had encountered magical practitioners who possessed great ability but lacked the wisdom to use their power responsibly. Both had seen promising young witches and wizards whose development was stunted by educational approaches that emphasized memorization over understanding and competition over collaboration. As dawn broke and the storm finally exhausted itself, they emerged from the cave as partners in an enterprise that neither had fully articulated but both instinctively understood. They would travel together, sharing the dangers and discoveries that lay ahead while working toward goals that were still taking shape in their minds but were already beginning to influence their choices and priorities. The friendship that had been forged in one night of shared refuge would prove to be one of the most significant relationships in the history of magical education, though neither of them could yet foresee the full scope of what they would accomplish together. Their partnership transformed the nature of Helga's journey from a solitary quest for understanding into a collaborative exploration of possibilities that neither could have achieved alone. Rowena's magical abilities complemented her own in ways that made both of them more effective than they had ever been individually, while her theoretical knowledge provided context and explanation for phenomena that Helga had observed but never fully understood. Together, they traveled through regions that would have been too dangerous for either to explore alone, their combined magical abilities allowing them to overcome obstacles and challenges that had kept certain areas closed to ordinary travelers. They visited ancient magical sites that contained knowledge and artifacts from earlier civilizations, studied with hermit wizards who possessed techniques that existed nowhere else, and observed magical creatures in their natural habitats rather than in the controlled conditions of captivity or domestication. But perhaps most importantly, they began to encounter other magical practitioners who shared their vision of what the wizarding world could become if it embraced principles of education and cooperation rather than remaining trapped in patterns of competition and conflict. Their growing reputation as powerful and principled magic users attracted the attention of others who were working towards similar goals, creating the nucleus of what would eventually become a movement that would reshape magical society throughout Britain and beyond. It was during their travels through the borderlands between England and Scotland that they first encountered Godric Gryffindor, a wizard whose reputation for both martial prowess and noble character had already made him legendary among those who fought against the dark forces that plagued the medieval magical world. He was leading a small band of warriors in pursuit of a group of dark wizards who had been terrorizing isolated magical communities, taking prisoners and artifacts for purposes that promised nothing good for anyone who valued peace and justice. Godric himself was everything that his reputation suggested, a powerful wizard whose magical abilities were matched by physical courage and an unwavering commitment to protecting those who could not protect themselves. But he was also more complex than the simple hero that his legend portrayed. A man who struggled with the moral implications of the violence that his role sometimes required, while never allowing those struggles to prevent him from acting when action was necessary. His encounter with Helga and Rowena began as a chance meeting on a forest path, but quickly developed into something more significant, as he recognized in them the same commitment to justice and protection that motivated his own efforts. Their magical abilities impressed him, but more than that, he was drawn to their vision of a world where magical power would be used to build rather than destroy, to heal rather than harm, and to bring people together rather than drive them apart. The three of them joined forces for what was originally intended to be a single mission against the dark wizards that Godric had been pursuing, but their collaboration proved so effective that it naturally extended into a more permanent partnership. Helga's healing magic and ability to create the supplies needed for extended campaigns complemented Rowena's tactical brilliance and Godric's combat skills, creating a team that was far more capable than the sum of its individual parts. But their partnership was more than just a practical arrangement for mutual benefit. It was the foundation of a friendship that would endure through decades of shared challenges and achievements. Each brought different strengths and perspectives to their collaboration, but they were united by common values and shared goals that transcended their individual backgrounds and experiences. Together, they began to develop the philosophical framework that would eventually guide their most important joint endeavor, though the full scope of that project was still years in the future. Their travels together took them throughout Britain and into continental Europe, where they encountered magical traditions and practices that broadened their understanding of what was possible when magic was applied with wisdom and dedication to worthy purposes. They studied with masters of various magical disciplines, learned techniques that had been developed in isolation and were unknown outside their regions of origin, and gradually assembled a comprehensive understanding of magical theory and practice that exceeded what any of them could have achieved individually. It was during one of these journeys, while investigating reports of unusual magical phenomena in the remote mountains of what would later be called Switzerland, that they encountered the fourth member of what would become their legendary partnership. Salazar Slytherin was already known throughout the magical world as a practitioner of unprecedented skill in certain specialized areas of magic, particularly those involving communication with serpents and the manipulation of mental processes that others found too dangerous or morally questionable to explore. His reputation was complex and somewhat controversial, as his magical innovations had proven extremely effective, but had also raised questions about the methods he employed and the goals he pursued through their application. Some viewed him as a brilliant researcher whose work would advance the understanding of magic in ways that would benefit everyone, while others worried that his willingness to explore forbidden areas of study indicated a moral flexibility that might eventually lead him into truly dark territory. The meeting between the three friends and Salazar was initially tense, as each group evaluated the other for potential threats and hidden agendas. But gradually, as they worked together to solve the magical mystery that had brought them all to the same remote location, they discovered that despite their very different approaches to magic and life, they shared certain fundamental commitments that made collaboration not just possible but beneficial for all involved. Salazar's magical abilities were undeniably impressive, and his theoretical knowledge in certain areas exceeded even Rowena's extensive education. But more than his technical skills, what made him valuable as a partner was his understanding of the darker aspects of human nature and magical practice. Knowledge that the other three needed if they were going to be effective in a world where not everyone shared their noble intentions and high moral standards. The four of them formed a partnership that combined all the major strengths needed for the great work that was beginning to take shape in their collective imagination, a school where young magical practitioners could receive the kind of comprehensive education that would prepare them not just to use magic effectively, but to use it wisely and responsibly. Each founder brought essential capabilities to this enterprise, but it was their collaboration that made the vision achievable rather than merely aspirational. Their travels together during this formative period were marked by adventures and challenges that tested every aspect of their abilities and strengthened the bonds of friendship and mutual respect that made their partnership possible. They faced dangers that would have destroyed lesser groups, overcame obstacles that seemed impossible to surmount, and gradually developed the reputation and resources that would be necessary to undertake the most ambitious educational project in the history of the magical world. But even as their friendship deepened and their shared vision became clearer, there were signs of tensions and fundamental disagreements that would eventually threaten everything they hoped to accomplish together. Salazar's growing conviction that magical ability was primarily inherited rather than learned, and that those from ancient magical bloodlines were inherently superior to those from mixed or non-magical backgrounds, created philosophical conflicts that the others found increasingly difficult to overlook or accommodate. These disagreements remained largely theoretical during their years of travel and adventure, but they would eventually become practical matters of policy and procedure when the time came to establish the school they were planning. For now, they were united by shared goals and mutual respect. But the seeds of future conflict had already been planted in conversations and decisions that seemed minor at the time, but would later prove to have fundamental importance for the fate of their joint enterprise. The golden cup that Helga carried continued to play a subtle but important role in their adventures, providing resources and capabilities that often made the difference between success and failure in their various undertakings. But its influence was growing stronger as her understanding of her heritage deepened and her commitment to using its power for worthy purposes became more complete. She was beginning to sense that the cup was not just a tool to be used, but a partner in the great work ahead, something that would help shape the school they were planning in ways that none of them yet fully comprehended. As their years of travel and preparation neared their end, the four friends stood at the threshold of an undertaking that would define not just their own lives, but the future of magical education throughout Britain and beyond. They had found each other through what seemed like chance encounters, but their partnership had been forged through shared trials and mutual recognition of qualities that complemented and strengthened each other's individual capabilities. The dream of a school where young witches and wizards could learn not just magic but wisdom, not just power but responsibility, was no longer just a vision but a practical possibility that they had the knowledge, abilities, and resources to make real. All that remained was to find the right location and begin the work of construction, though they could not yet know that their greatest challenges lay not in the building of their school, but in the preservation of the unity that had made its creation possible. The Scottish Highlands stretched before them like a vast tapestry woven from mist and heather, their peaks crowned with snow even in the gentler months when spring flowers carpeted the lower slopes in brilliant displays of purple and gold. It was here, in this landscape that seemed to exist at the very edge of the world, that the four founders would create something unprecedented in the history of magical education, a school that would endure for 1,000 years and shape the destinies of countless witches and wizards yet unborn. The site they chose for their great undertaking was a rocky promontory that jutted out into a dark lake, its shores shrouded in mists that seemed to hold their own ancient secrets. The location possessed qualities that made it ideal for their purposes: isolation that would protect their students from the conflicts that plagued the wider world, natural, magical resonance that would amplify and focus the energies needed for advanced spell work, and defensive advantages that would allow a relatively small number of practitioners to hold the position against much larger forces should such protection ever prove necessary. But more than these practical considerations, the site felt right in ways that went beyond rational analysis. Each of the founders experienced a sense of homecoming when they first set foot on the rocky ground that would support their castle, as if they had been drawn to this place by forces larger than their own conscious intentions. The very stones seemed to welcome their presence, and the lake's dark waters reflected not just their physical forms but something deeper: the potential of what they could accomplish together if they remained true to their shared vision. The construction of Hogwarts Castle was itself a feat of magical engineering that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible even by the most advanced practitioners of their era. Each founder contributed specialized knowledge and techniques that had been developed through years of study and practical application. But the true miracle lay in how these different approaches to magic could be woven together into a unified whole that was greater than the sum of its individual components. Helga's contributions to the castle's design reflected her deep understanding of earth magic and the principles of harmony between constructed and natural environments. She worked with the stone itself as if it were a living thing, coaxing it into shapes and configurations that provided both structural integrity and aesthetic beauty while maintaining the site's natural magical properties. Her techniques ensured that the castle would not merely sit upon the landscape, but would become part of it, drawing strength from the ancient forces that flowed through the highland bedrock while adding its own magical signature to the complex patterns of power that characterized the region. The foundations she helped to create were more than mere structural supports. They were conduits for the earth magic that would provide the castle with a form of stability that went beyond the merely physical. Through her careful application of techniques that had been passed down through generations of her family, the castle's stones were imbued with protective qualities that would make them resistant to both natural weathering and magical attack. More importantly, these foundations would serve as anchors for the larger ward network that would eventually protect the entire school from threats that ranged from simple trespass to organized military assault. The chambers that would serve as Helga's domain within the castle were designed to reflect both her practical needs as an educator and her deeper understanding of what young witches and wizards required for optimal magical development. The Hufflepuff common room was positioned to take advantage of the earth magic that flowed through the castle's foundations, creating an environment where students could feel genuinely secure and comfortable while they learned to master abilities that could be dangerous if approached with fear or uncertainty. Unlike the common rooms that the other founders would create, Helga's domain emphasized comfort over grandeur, functionality over impressive display. The chambers were lined with honey-colored wood that had been treated with preservation charms, guaranteeing it would remain warm and welcoming for centuries to come. Comfortable chairs and sofas were arranged to encourage conversation and collaboration rather than competition, while large windows provided views of the gardens that she was already planning to establish on the grounds surrounding the castle. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the Hufflepuff quarters was their connection to the kitchens that would serve the entire school. Helga insisted that these facilities be positioned directly adjacent to her house's common room, understanding that the preparation and sharing of meals was one of the most fundamental forms of magic. the transformation of raw ingredients into nourishment that sustained both body and spirit. The kitchens she designed were vast and well-equipped, capable of producing meals for hundreds of students while maintaining the quality and care that she had learned from Twillin during her childhood in Morwen's cottage. The magical enhancements built into the kitchen facilities were subtle but comprehensive, designed to ensure that every meal would be prepared with the same attention to nutritional and magical properties that characterized the finest healing potions. The ovens were enchanted to maintain perfect temperatures for different types of cooking, while the preparation surfaces incorporated techniques that would prevent contamination and preserve the magical properties of sensitive ingredients. Most importantly, the entire kitchen complex was designed to be a place where the house elves who would operate it could work with dignity and take pride in their contributions to the school's mission. For Helga understood something that her colleagues sometimes overlooked, that the daily necessities of life were not merely practical concerns to be handled by others, but fundamental aspects of the magical education process itself. Students who were well-fed and comfortable would be better able to focus on their studies and develop their abilities to their fullest potential. More than that, the shared experience of meals prepared with care and magical enhancement would help build the sense of community and belonging that was essential for young people who were learning to navigate the complex responsibilities that came with magical ability. The dormitories she designed for her students reflected this same philosophy of comfort and security. Unlike the more austere accommodations that some magical schools provided, the Hufflepuff sleeping quarters were designed to feel like homes away from home, with individual spaces that allowed for privacy when needed while maintaining the sense of shared purpose that characterized the house. Each bed was surrounded by hangings that could provide complete privacy for study or rest, while common areas encouraged the kind of informal interaction that built lasting friendships and mutual support networks. The magical protections woven into the dormitory design went beyond simple security measures to encompass psychological and spiritual well-being. Charms that promoted restful sleep and pleasant dreams were built into the very architecture, while detection spells would alert the house's prefects and head of house to any student who was experiencing serious distress or magical difficulties. These protections were designed to be supportive rather than intrusive, providing help when needed while respecting the autonomy and dignity of students who were learning to become independent magical practitioners. But Helga's greatest contribution to the physical structure of Hogwarts lay in the gardens and greenhouse complexes that she established on the grounds surrounding the castle. These facilities were far more than simple sources of ingredients for potions and magical research. They were living laboratories where students could observe and interact with the natural processes that underlying all magical phenomena. The gardens were designed to showcase plants from every climate and magical environment, creating opportunities for hands-on learning that no textbook could provide. The greenhouse complex represented the cutting edge of magical architecture and environmental control, incorporating techniques that allowed for the cultivation of plants that required very specific conditions to thrive. Some greenhouses maintained the tropical climates needed for rare medicinal herbs, while others recreated the Arctic conditions preferred by plants used in advanced protective charms. The most specialized greenhouse was designed specifically for magical plants that were dangerous to handle, with containment systems that could prevent escape while allowing careful study and cultivation for legitimate educational and research purposes. The paths that wound through the garden complex were designed not just for practical transportation, but for contemplation and learning. Strategic placement of benches and observation points encouraged students to spend time in quiet reflection among the plants, developing the patience and observational skills that were essential for advanced botanical magic. The garden's layout also incorporated elements of magical theory, with plant arrangements that demonstrated principles of magical interaction and energy flow that students could observe directly rather than simply reading about in theoretical texts. The establishment of the house system that would define Hogwarts for centuries to come reflected the founders' recognition that different students would thrive under different approaches to magical education, and that the diversity of learning styles and personality types represented a strength rather than a problem to be solved. Each founder would take responsibility for students who shared their particular values and approaches to magic, providing specialized mentorship that could guide young witches and wizards toward their fullest potential. For Helga, the values that would define Hufflepuff House were those that had guided her own development and had proven their worth through the challenges she had faced during her journey from isolated orphan to respected magical practitioner. Hard work and dedication were essential, but they needed to be balanced with loyalty to friends and colleagues, patience with those who learned at different speeds, and fairness in dealing with conflicts and competition. Most importantly, Hufflepuff students would be expected to understand that magical ability carried with it the responsibility to use that ability in service of others, particularly those who were vulnerable or in need of protection. The selection process that would identify potential Hufflepuff students was designed to look beyond simple magical power or academic achievement to identify young people who possessed the character traits that would allow them to flourish. Within the house's particular approach to magical education, students who demonstrated kindness toward others, who showed willingness to help those who were struggling, who approached challenges with persistence rather than expecting immediate success, these were the qualities that marked someone as a potential Hufflepuff, regardless of their family background or previous magical training. This approach to student selection reflected Helga's fundamental belief that magical ability was distributed throughout the population without regard to blood status or social position, and that the school's mission should be to identify and develop talent wherever it existed, rather than simply serving the children of established magical families. This philosophy would put her increasingly at odds with Salazar Slytherin's growing conviction that magical education should be reserved for those who could prove pure magical ancestry. But during the early years of the school, such disagreements remained largely theoretical rather than practical. The curriculum that Helga developed for her students emphasized practical applications of magic that would prepare them for useful careers in the magical world, while also providing them with the theoretical background needed to continue their education throughout their lives. Her classes covered not just the standard subjects required by magical education, but also specialized areas of study that reflected her particular expertise and interests, advanced herbology that went far beyond simple ingredient identification, healing magic that encompassed both emergency treatment and long-term health maintenance, and household magic that elevated domestic tasks to the level of sophisticated magical practice. But perhaps most importantly, Hufflepuff students received extensive training in what might be called the ethics of magical practice, the principles that should guide decisions about when and how to use magical abilities in interactions with others. These lessons emphasized that magical power was not a license for domination or exploitation, but a responsibility to protect and serve those who lacked such abilities. Students learned to consider the long-term consequences of their actions, to respect the autonomy and dignity of both magical and non-magical people, and to understand their roles as guardians of knowledge and abilities that could be used for either good or ill. The house elves who came to work in the Hogwarts kitchens did so not as bound servants, but as valued members of the school community whose contributions were recognized and appreciated. Helga's approach to their employment reflected her understanding that the magic which bound house elves to wizarding families was complex and not entirely voluntary, and that ethical magical practitioners had an obligation to ensure that such relationships were mutually beneficial rather than exploitative. Under her guidance, the Hogwarts house elves were provided with comfortable quarters, adequate rest and recreation, and opportunities for professional development that allowed them to take pride in their work and advance their skills over time. More importantly, they were treated with the same respect and consideration that would be shown to any other member of the school staff. Their opinions were sought on matters related to their areas of expertise, and their welfare was considered an important factor in decisions about school policies and procedures. This approach to house-elf relations was controversial even among her fellow founders, as it challenged established norms about the proper relationships between magical species and raised questions about practices that most wizarding families took for granted. But Helga's position was firm. The school would demonstrate the highest ethical standards in all its practices, and this necessarily included ensuring that everyone who contributed to its mission was treated with dignity and respect regardless of their species or magical abilities. The early years of Hogwarts were marked by rapid growth and development as word of the school's unique approach to magical education spread throughout Britain and beyond. Students arrived not just from the local Scottish population but from across the British Isles and even from continental Europe, drawn by reports of educational opportunities that were unprecedented in their comprehensiveness and quality. The school's reputation attracted not just students, but also visitors who came to observe the founders' techniques and perhaps adapt them for use in their own educational endeavors. Helga's role during this period extended far beyond her responsibilities as head of Hufflepuff House to encompass many of the practical aspects of school administration that her colleagues were less well equipped to handle. Her experience with household management and her understanding of the logistical challenges involved in caring for large numbers of people made her invaluable in establishing the systems and procedures that would allow the school to be alive, function effectively as it continued to grow. She took personal responsibility for ensuring that students' basic needs were met, that they were adequately fed, comfortably housed, and provided with the materials and equipment needed for their studies. But her approach to these responsibilities went beyond mere efficiency to encompass a deeper understanding of how physical comfort and security affected students' ability to learn and develop their magical abilities. A student who was worried about having enough to eat or staying warm at night could not give full attention to mastering complex spells or understanding theoretical principles. The meal systems she established became one of the most celebrated aspects of Hogwarts life, providing not just adequate nutrition but culinary experiences that demonstrated the sophisticated applications of magic to the preparation and presentation of food. Each meal was an opportunity for learning, as students could observe the effects of different magical techniques on ingredients and finished dishes. More importantly, the shared experience of excellent meals created a sense of community and belonging that transcended house loyalties and helped build the school spirit that would become one of Hogwarts' defining characteristics. The magical enhancements that Helga built into the castle's daily operations were designed to be educational as well as functional, providing students with constant examples of how magic could be applied to solve practical problems and improve the quality of life for everyone in the community. The self-lighting torches that illuminated the corridors demonstrated principles of sustainable magical energy, while the moving staircases served both as transportation systems and as lessons in spatial magic and architectural enchantment. Her collaboration with the other founders during this period was characterized by mutual respect and shared commitment to their common goals. Despite growing philosophical differences that would eventually threaten the unity of their partnership, each founder brought essential skills and perspectives to the joint enterprise, and their different approaches to magic and education complemented each other in ways that made the school stronger and more comprehensive than any of them could have created individually. Godric's emphasis on courage and martial magic provided essential balance to Helga's focus on nurturing and protection, ensuring that students would be prepared to defend themselves and others when necessary, while also learning to value peace and cooperation over conflict and competition. Rowena's brilliant theoretical insights helped all the founders understand the deeper principles that governed their various specialized techniques, while her innovations in magical research methods established Hogwarts as a center of learning that would advance the frontiers of magical knowledge for centuries to come. Even Salazar's controversial specializations in mental magic and serpent communication provided valuable contributions to the school's educational mission. Despite the growing concerns about his attitudes towards students from non-magical backgrounds, his techniques for understanding and influencing psychological processes were essential for teachers who needed to motivate and inspire students with widely varying backgrounds and abilities, while his research into magical creature communication opened new possibilities for understanding the complex relationships between different forms of magical life. The golden cup that had guided Helga throughout her journey from orphaned child to respected educator continued to play a subtle but important role in the school's development, though its influence was so carefully integrated into the castle's other magical systems that few people recognized its presence. The cup's power to provide exactly what was needed most in any given situation made it invaluable for solving the countless small problems that arose in managing a large and complex institution, while its ability to enhance the nutritional and magical properties of food ensured that students would develop to their fullest potential during their years at the school. But the cup's most significant contribution lay in its influence on the castle's overall magical atmosphere, creating an environment where students and staff could feel genuinely secure and welcome, regardless of their backgrounds or previous experiences. The cup's magic worked to dissolve barriers and prejudices that might otherwise have divided the school community, encouraging people to focus on their common goals and shared humanity rather than the differences that separated them. This influence was particularly important during the school's early years, when students from very different cultural and magical traditions were learning to live and work together in close proximity for extended periods. The cup's subtle magic helped create bonds of friendship and mutual respect that transcended the social divisions that characterized the broader wizarding world, establishing patterns of interaction that would become part of Hogwarts' permanent culture. As the school's reputation continued to grow and its student body expanded, Helga found herself taking on an increasingly important role as mediator and counselor for young people who were struggling with the challenges of magical education and adolescent development. Her office became a refuge for students who needed someone to listen to their problems and provide guidance that went beyond simple academic instruction, while her quarters in the castle served as an informal gathering place for anyone who needed comfort or support. Her approach to these pastoral responsibilities reflected her deep understanding that magical education was about far more than simply learning to cast spells or brew potions. It was about developing the character and wisdom needed to use magical abilities responsibly throughout one's life. Students who came to her with academic difficulties often discovered that their real problems lay in lack of confidence or unclear understanding of their goals, while those who sought help with personal conflicts learned techniques for resolving disagreements that preserved relationships and promoted mutual understanding. The success of her approach to student counseling and support led other members of the school staff to seek her advice on their own teaching and administrative challenges, establishing her as an informal leader whose influence extended far beyond her official role as head of Hufflepuff House. Her colleagues recognized that her insights into human nature and her ability to find practical solutions to complex problems made her invaluable for addressing the countless issues that arose in operating an innovative educational institution. But even as Hogwarts flourished and its founders worked together to create something unprecedented in the history of magical education, there were signs of tensions and disagreements that would eventually threaten everything they had built together. Salazar's growing obsession with blood purity and his increasing hostility towards students from non-magical backgrounds created philosophical conflicts that could not be resolved through the diplomatic approaches that had previously maintained harmony among the founders. These disagreements affected every aspect of school operations, from admissions policies that determined which students would be accepted to curriculum decisions that shaped what those students would learn during their years at Hogwarts. Helga found herself increasingly in the position of defending students and policies that Salazar viewed as contamination of the school's mission, while trying to maintain the collegial relationships that made collaborative leadership possible. The growing tensions took their toll on the school's atmosphere as students and staff became aware of fundamental disagreements among their leaders about the very purpose and nature of magical education. What had once been a unified community working toward shared goals began to show signs of the divisions that would eventually split the school and deprive it of one of its founders. But for now, during these golden early years, Hogwarts remained a place where young witches and wizards could develop their abilities to their fullest potential while learning the wisdom and ethical principles needed to use those abilities for the benefit of all. Helga's contributions to this achievement were fundamental and lasting, establishing traditions and approaches that would continue to shape magical education long after the original founders had passed into legend. The castle that rose from the Scottish Highlands under their joint efforts was more than merely an impressive architectural achievement. It was the physical embodiment of their shared vision of what magical education could become, when it was guided by principles of excellence, inclusion, and service to others. And at its heart, woven into every stone and every spell, was the gentle but powerful influence of Helga Hufflepuff and the golden cup that had guided her journey from obscure orphan to legendary founder. The dawn of Hogwarts' golden age broke like sunlight through ancient stained glass, casting patterns of hope and possibility across corridors that hummed with the eager voices of young witches and wizards discovering the full scope of their magical heritage. In the years following the school's establishment, when the four founders worked in harmony and their shared vision seemed destined to reshape the very nature of magical education, Helga Hufflepuff found herself at the center of innovations that would influence wizarding society for centuries to come. The reputation of their school had spread throughout Britain and beyond with a speed that surprised even its creators, carried by graduates who returned to their home communities as living testimonials to the transformative power of comprehensive magical education. These early alumni spoke not just of spells mastered and potions brewed, but of a deeper understanding of magic's place in the natural order, of the responsibilities that came with power, and of the bonds of friendship and mutual respect that could unite people from vastly different backgrounds in common purpose. Young people arrived at Hogwarts not just from the established magical families of Britain, but from remote villages where hedge wizards practiced their craft in isolation. From continental Europe, where different traditions of magic had developed along separate paths, and even from distant lands where magical practices bore little resemblance to anything the founders had previously encountered. This diversity of backgrounds created both opportunities and challenges that pushed the school's educational approaches far beyond what any of them had originally envisioned. Helga's response to this influx of students from varied magical traditions was to expand her own understanding of the universal principles that underlied all magical practice, while simultaneously developing teaching methods that could accommodate learning styles shaped by radically different cultural assumptions about the nature of magic itself. She spent countless hours with students whose previous magical education had emphasized combat and conquest, helping them understand how the same energies could be channeled toward healing and nurturing without any loss of power or effectiveness. The greenhouse complexes that she had originally designed to support the basic needs of magical education grew into vast botanical gardens that contained specimens from every corner of the known magical world. These facilities became living libraries where students could observe firsthand the relationships between magical plants and their native environments, learning to understand how geographical and climatic factors influenced the development of different magical properties in similar species. Her innovations in magical horticulture during this period pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible in the cultivation and care of magical plants. Through careful application of earth magic principles that she had learned from her family's ancient traditions, combined with new techniques developed through collaboration with students and colleagues from different magical backgrounds, she succeeded in creating environments where plants from incompatible climates could thrive in close proximity to each other. The most ambitious of these projects was the creation of a greenhouse that contained multiple distinct ecological zones, each maintaining the precise conditions needed for different categories of magical plants, while allowing them to interact and influence each other in ways that occurred nowhere else in nature. Students could observe how plants that had never coexisted in natural settings formed new symbiotic relationships when brought together under carefully controlled conditions, while researchers documented the emergence of hybrid species that possessed magical properties unknown in their parent plants. These botanical innovations had practical applications that extended far beyond academic interest or research curiosity. The expanded variety of magical plants available for study and harvesting allowed for advances in potion making that revolutionized the treatment of magical injuries and illnesses that had previously been considered incurable. Helga's students became renowned throughout the wizarding world for their ability to brew healing draughts that worked more effectively and with fewer side effects than anything previously available. But perhaps her most significant contribution to magical medicine during this period was her development of what would later be called nutritional magic, the art of enhancing ordinary foods with magical properties that promoted health and magical development over extended periods. This approach to healing emphasized prevention and gradual improvement rather than dramatic interventions for acute problems, reflecting her deep understanding that the most powerful magic often worked through subtle influences applied consistently over time. The dining halls at Hogwarts became laboratories where students could observe the practical applications of nutritional magic while enjoying meals that were simultaneously delicious and beneficial to their physical and magical development. Each dish was carefully designed to provide not just adequate calories and essential nutrients, but also magical enhancement that would support students' growing abilities and help them maintain the energy needed for intensive magical study and practice. The house elves who worked in the kitchens under Helga's guidance were not merely food service workers, but skilled magical practitioners whose abilities in domestic magic matched or exceeded those of many wizards who specialized in more dramatic forms of spellcasting. She insisted that they be given opportunities to develop their skills through formal instruction and collaborative research, recognizing that their intimate understanding of household magic contained insights that could benefit the entire magical community. This approach to house elf relations created a model that challenged prevailing assumptions throughout the wizarding world about the proper relationships between magical species. Visitors to Hogwarts were often surprised to encounter house elves who spoke confidently about their work, offered suggestions for improvements in magical techniques, and clearly took pride in their contributions to the school's educational mission, rather than simply following orders without question or creativity. The success of this collaborative approach led Helga to expand her research into the magical abilities of other species that were typically dismissed as inferior to wizards despite possessing unique capabilities that could enhance magical practice in significant ways. She established formal relationships with centaur communities in the Forbidden Forest, learning from their deep understanding of astronomical magic and natural cycles that influenced the timing and effectiveness of various magical procedures. Her work with magical creatures extended beyond simple academic collaboration to encompass genuine partnerships that benefited all participants while advancing the boundaries of magical knowledge. The centaurs shared their techniques for predicting magical weather patterns and seasonal variations in magical energy, while Helga and her students provided assistance with healing magic and protective charms that helped the forest community defend itself against hostile intrusions from dark wizards and dangerous creatures. These partnerships with non-human magical beings reflected Helga's fundamental belief that magical ability was not the exclusive province of wizards and witches, but was distributed throughout the natural world in forms that could be studied, understood, and incorporated into more comprehensive approaches to magical practice. This philosophy put her at the forefront of what would later be recognized as one of the most significant developments in magical theory, the understanding that magic was an ecological phenomenon that connected all living things, rather than a special gift granted only to certain species. The practical applications of this ecological approach to magic were most evident in the advanced courses that Helga developed for older students who had mastered the basic principles of magical practice and were ready to explore more sophisticated applications. These classes emphasized the integration of different magical techniques into comprehensive approaches that could address complex problems requiring sustained effort over extended periods. Students learned to combine herbology with potions, healing magic with protective charms, and domestic magic with defensive spells in ways that created synergistic effects far more powerful than any individual technique could achieve alone. The most advanced students were introduced to what Helga called harmony magic, the art of working with natural magical patterns rather than attempting to override or control them through force of will. These teaching innovations attracted attention from magical practitioners throughout Europe and beyond, as word spread of educational techniques that could help students achieve levels of magical competence that had previously been considered exceptional rather than routine. Delegations of educators and researchers arrived at Hogwarts to observe Helga's methods and attempt to understand how they could be adapted for use in other magical schools and training programs. But the visitors discovered that Helga's techniques could not be simply copied and applied elsewhere without understanding the philosophical framework that made them effective. Her approach to magical education was based on fundamental assumptions about the nature of magic and its relationship to the natural world that challenged many established beliefs about magical practice and required significant changes in both curriculum and teaching methods. The most important of these philosophical innovations was her emphasis on what she called reciprocal magic, the understanding that truly effective magical practice required giving back to the natural systems from which magical energy was drawn rather than simply taking what was needed without consideration for long-term consequences. Students learned to approach magic as stewardship rather than exploitation, understanding their role as caretakers of natural magical patterns rather than masters who could manipulate those patterns without regard for their effects on the broader magical ecosystem. This approach to magical ethics had practical implications that extended far beyond classroom instruction to encompass every aspect of life at Hogwarts. The castle's energy systems were designed to work in harmony with natural magical flows rather than drawing power from external sources without regard for environmental impact. Waste disposal and resource management were handled through magical techniques that actually enhanced rather than depleted the magical environment surrounding the school. The gardens and greenhouse complexes served as demonstration sites where students could observe the long-term benefits of sustainable magical practices, while also providing opportunities for hands-on learning about the complex relationships between different forms of magical life. Advanced students participated in research projects that documented the effects of various magical techniques on local ecosystems, contributing to a growing body of knowledge about responsible magical practice that would influence wizarding society for generations. The success of these innovations in sustainable magic led to invitations for Helga to consult on magical projects throughout Britain and continental Europe. As communities that had experienced environmental problems from irresponsible magical practices sought guidance on remediation and prevention techniques, her work during this period established her as one of the leading experts on what would later be called conservation magic. Though she always insisted that her techniques were simply applications of principles that had been understood by magical practitioners for centuries before being forgotten in the pursuit of more dramatic and immediately impressive magical effects. These consulting activities brought her into contact with magical communities that were struggling with problems created by the growing tensions between magical and non-magical populations throughout medieval Europe. As political conflicts intensified and religious authorities began to view magical practices with increasing suspicion and hostility, many wizarding families found themselves forced to choose between hiding their abilities completely or facing persecution that could result in exile or even death. Helga's response to these challenges was to develop techniques for magical concealment and protection that could allow magical communities to survive periods of persecution while maintaining their traditions and continuing to practice their arts in secret. These techniques went beyond simple hiding spells to encompass comprehensive approaches to community security that could protect entire populations from detection and harassment by hostile authorities. The most sophisticated of these protection systems involved creating magical enclaves that existed in partial separation from normal physical space, allowing magical communities to carry on their traditional way of life while remaining effectively invisible to non-magical observers. These enclaves required enormous amounts of magical energy to establish and maintain, but they provided security that could not be achieved through conventional concealment methods. The development of enclave magic required collaboration between Helga and magical practitioners from many different traditions, as the techniques needed to create stable alternate dimensional spaces drew upon specialized knowledge that existed only in certain ancient magical traditions. The success of these projects demonstrated the benefits of the collaborative approach to magical research that she had pioneered at Hogwarts, while also providing practical solutions to problems that threatened the survival of magical culture throughout Europe. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact of her work during this period was the establishment of educational exchanges that brought students from magical schools throughout Europe to study at Hogwarts while sending Hogwarts students abroad to learn techniques and approaches that were not available in Britain. These exchanges created networks of personal and professional relationships that would prove invaluable for maintaining communication and cooperation between magical communities, even during periods of political conflict and social upheaval. The international students who came to study with Helga brought with them magical techniques and theoretical approaches that challenged many assumptions about the proper methods for magical education and practice. Students from Northern European schools where magic was primarily taught through apprenticeship systems had difficulty adapting to classroom instruction, while those from institutions that emphasized theoretical study over practical application struggled with the hands-on requirements of Helga's courses. Her solution to these challenges was to develop individualized educational plans that could accommodate different learning styles and previous educational experiences while ensuring that all students achieve competency in the essential skills needed for safe and effective magical practice. This individualized approach required enormous amounts of time and energy from both instructors and students, but it produced graduates whose abilities and knowledge exceeded what could be achieved through standardized educational approaches. The success of these individualized educational programs led to requests from magical families throughout Europe for Helga to accept their children as private students who would receive completely customized magical education designed around their particular abilities and interests. While she could not accommodate all such requests due to her responsibilities at Hogwarts, she did accept a small number of special students whose unique circumstances or exceptional abilities made them particularly suitable subjects for experimental educational approaches. These private students often came from magical families that had been displaced by political conflicts or social persecution, children whose previous magical education had been interrupted by circumstances beyond their control. Working with them gave Helga insights into the psychological and emotional challenges faced by young witches and wizards who had experienced trauma or displacement, leading to the development of therapeutic approaches that combined magical healing with practical education in ways that could help damaged young people recover their confidence and abilities. The therapeutic techniques she developed during this period became another area of innovation that attracted attention from healers and educators throughout the magical world. Her understanding of how magical abilities could be affected by emotional trauma, combined with her knowledge of healing magic and nutritional approaches to health maintenance, created new possibilities for treating conditions that had previously been considered permanent or incurable. Students who came to Hogwarts with magical abilities that had been damaged or suppressed by traumatic experiences found that Helga's combination of gentle magical intervention, careful nutritional support, and patient educational guidance could often restore their capabilities to levels that exceeded their pre-trauma performance. These successes led to referrals from healers throughout Britain and beyond, as word spread of techniques that could help magical practitioners recover from injuries and setbacks that had previously ended their careers. But the most remarkable aspect of this therapeutic work was its integration into the regular educational program at Hogwarts, as Helga developed ways to provide healing and support services that could benefit all students rather than being limited to those with obvious problems or dramatic needs. The dining hall became a place where meals were designed not just to satisfy hunger, but to provide ongoing support for physical and magical health, while the greenhouse facilities offered opportunities for therapeutic interaction with plants and natural environments that could help students maintain emotional balance during the stresses of intensive magical education. The house system itself became a therapeutic community where older students took responsibility for supporting and mentoring younger ones, creating networks of mutual aid that could provide help and guidance during difficult periods while building relationships that would last throughout their lives. Helga's influence on this aspect of Hogwarts culture was subtle but profound, establishing patterns of caring and mutual responsibility that would become permanent features of the school's social environment. These innovations in community building and mutual support reflected her deep understanding that magical education was not just about individual development, but about creating social structures that could sustain and protect magical communities during periods of external threat or internal conflict. The students who graduated from Hogwarts during this golden age carried with them not just magical skills and theoretical knowledge, but also practical experience in building and maintaining communities based on principles of mutual respect and shared responsibility. As the years passed and Hogwarts' reputation continued to grow, Helga found herself increasingly recognized as one of the most influential figures in the magical world. Sought out for advice and consultation on matters ranging from educational policy to community development to international relations between magical populations. But she always insisted that her greatest achievement was not personal recognition, but the establishment of educational approaches that could help others achieve their own potential while contributing to the welfare of the magical community as a whole. The golden cup that had guided her throughout her journey from orphan child to legendary educator continued to play a subtle but important role in all these achievements, its influence woven so seamlessly into the fabric of daily life at Hogwarts that few people recognized its presence. The cup's power to provide exactly what was needed most in any situation made it invaluable for solving the countless challenges that arose in managing such an ambitious and innovative educational institution. While its ability to enhance the nutritional and magical properties of food ensured that students and staff could maintain the energy and health needed for sustained creative work. But perhaps the cup's most important contribution during this golden age was its influence on the collaborative relationships between the founders, helping to maintain the harmony and mutual respect that made their joint achievements possible. The cup's magic worked to smooth over minor conflicts and misunderstandings that might otherwise have escalated into serious disputes, while encouraging each founder to focus on their areas of greatest strength rather than competing for recognition or authority in areas where others were more qualified. This collaborative harmony would not last forever, as philosophical differences that had been manageable during the early years of the school began to harden into fundamental disagreements about the very nature and purpose of magical education. But during these golden years, when all four founders worked together in pursuit of their shared vision, Hogwarts achieved a level of educational excellence and innovation that would never again be matched, establishing traditions and approaches that would continue to influence magical education for 1,000 years and beyond. The autumn of Hogwarts' 7th year of existence brought with it changes that seemed to seep into the very stones of the castle like water finding cracks in ancient foundations. What had once been a harmonious collaboration between four visionary educators began to show signs of strain that no amount of diplomatic conversation or careful compromise could fully address. The philosophical differences that had always existed between the founders, previously manageable through mutual respect and shared commitment to their common goals, were hardening into fundamental disagreements about the very nature of magical education and the future direction of wizarding society itself. Helga Hufflepuff felt these tensions most acutely during the daily interactions that had once been sources of joy and intellectual stimulation, but were increasingly marked by careful word choice and diplomatic silence about subjects that could no longer be discussed without risk of open conflict. The morning meetings where the four founders had traditionally planned the day's activities and addressed any issues that had arisen during the previous evening now carried an undercurrent of wariness that made even routine, administrative decisions into potential battlegrounds for larger philosophical disputes. The source of these growing tensions lay primarily in Salazar Slytherin's evolving attitudes toward the student body and the school's admission policies. What had begun as casual comments about the superior magical abilities of students from ancient wizarding families had gradually developed into a comprehensive ideology that divided the magical world into categories of worth based solely on ancestry and blood status. Students whose parents were both magical practitioners were inherently superior to those with one non-magical parent, while those from completely non-magical backgrounds were viewed as contamination that threatened the purity and effectiveness of magical education. These attitudes affected every aspect of school life in ways both obvious and subtle. Salazar's teaching methods increasingly favored students who could trace their magical ancestry back multiple generations, providing them with advanced instruction and specialized attention, while treating those from mixed or non-magical backgrounds as academic charity cases who should be grateful for any education they received. His house became increasingly insular and elitist, developing traditions and practices that emphasized the superiority of pure-blood students while subtly excluding or marginalizing those whose family histories did not meet his evolving standards of acceptability. The impact on the broader school community was profound and troubling. Students who had previously worked together on projects and formed friendships across house boundaries began to self-segregate along lines that reflected the growing divisions among the founders. Slytherin students became reluctant to collaborate with those from other houses, particularly Hufflepuffs, whose ranks included many students from non-magical backgrounds, while students from mixed or Muggle families began to feel increasingly unwelcome in areas of the castle where Slytherin influence was strongest. Helga's response to these developments was shaped by her fundamental beliefs about the nature of magical ability and the purpose of magical education. Her own experience had taught her that magical talent appeared throughout the population without regard to family background, and that the most important qualities for magical practitioners were character traits like dedication, loyalty, and willingness to use power responsibly, rather than simple genetic inheritance of magical abilities from previous generations. More than philosophical disagreement, she was witnessing the practical consequences of Salazar's attitudes in the daily lives of students whose educational experience was being compromised by prejudice and exclusion. Young witches and wizards who had arrived at Hogwarts with enthusiasm for learning and excitement about their magical potential were beginning to doubt their own worth and abilities when confronted with constant suggestions that their 555 backgrounds made them inherently inferior to their classmates. The most troubling cases involved students who had been placed in Hufflepuff, specifically because their character traits made them ideal candidates for the kind of comprehensive magical education that emphasized service and mutual support. These young people had often overcome significant obstacles to reach Hogwarts, demonstrating exactly the kind of dedication and perseverance that Helga valued most highly. To see them demoralized and discouraged by attitudes that questioned their right to be at the school at all was personally painful and professionally unacceptable. Her attempts to address these problems through direct conversation with Salazar had initially been met with polite dismissal of her concerns as oversensitivity to natural differences in student ability and motivation. He argued that his higher expectations for pure-blood students were simply recognition of their superior potential, while his more limited investment in mixed-blood students reflected realistic assessment of their likely achievements rather than prejudice or discrimination. But as his positions became more extreme, and his treatment of certain students more obviously unfair, these diplomatic exchanges gave way to increasingly heated arguments that threatened the collegial relationships that had made the founders' collaboration possible. Salazar's insistence that the school's mission should focus exclusively on students from ancient magical families represented a fundamental betrayal of the inclusive principles that had guided Hogwarts' establishment. While his growing hostility toward house elves and other magical creatures challenged basic assumptions about the school's commitment to ethical treatment of all magical beings, the house elves who worked in the Hogwarts kitchens and maintained the castle's daily operations found themselves caught in the middle of these philosophical disputes. As Salazar's attitudes toward magical creatures affected their working conditions and professional relationships in ways that went far beyond simple policy disagreements. Where Helga had established collaborative relationships that recognized house elves as skilled magical practitioners whose contributions were essential to the school's success, Salazar viewed them as tools whose proper function was unquestioning obedience to wizarding authority. This fundamental disagreement about the nature of magical creatures and their proper relationships with wizards created practical problems that affected every aspect of school operations. House elves, who had become accustomed to being consulted about their areas of expertise and treated with respect for their knowledge and abilities, found themselves subject to increasingly arbitrary demands and dismissive treatment from Salazar and students who adopted his attitudes. The impact on morale and efficiency was immediate and obvious. House elves who had previously taken pride in their work and approached their responsibilities with enthusiasm began to show signs of the dejection and resignation that characterized their relationships with less enlightened wizarding. Employers. The quality of meals declined as kitchen staff lost their motivation for creative excellence, while maintenance of the castle's living quarters became perfunctory rather than the careful attention to detail that had previously characterized house elf service at Hogwarts. Helga's attempts to protect the house elves from this treatment led to direct confrontations with Salazar that revealed the depth of their philosophical differences about fundamental questions of justice and ethical behavior. His position that magical creatures existed primarily to serve wizarding convenience made meaningful dialogue about their rights and welfare nearly impossible, while her insistence that ethical magical practice required respectful treatment of all magical beings was dismissed as sentimental nonsense that interfered with practical school operations. These disputes about house elf treatment were symptomatic of larger disagreements about the school's mission and the values that should guide magical education. Salazar's increasingly narrow definition of who deserved full participation in the magical community was accompanied by growing hostility toward anyone who challenged his positions or questioned his authority to make such determinations. Faculty members who expressed support for inclusive policies found themselves subject to professional retaliation, while students who defended classmates from pure-blood harassment faced academic penalties that seemed to contradict the school's stated commitment to fairness and equal treatment. The other two founders found themselves forced to choose sides in disputes that they had previously hoped could be resolved through compromise and mutual accommodation. Godric Gryffindor's natural inclination was to support inclusive policies and defend students who were being treated unfairly, but his friendship with Salazar and his hope that their partnership could be preserved made him reluctant to take positions that would make reconciliation impossible. Rowena Ravenclaw approached the growing conflicts from a more analytical perspective, attempting to find philosophical frameworks that could accommodate the different positions while preserving the collaborative relationships that had made their joint achievements possible. But her efforts at intellectual mediation were increasingly frustrated by the emotional intensity of the disputes and the practical consequences of Salazar's policies for students and staff who were being directly affected by discriminatory treatment. The impact of these internal conflicts on the school's external reputation was beginning to become apparent as reports of divisions among the founders spread throughout the magical community. Prospective students from non-magical backgrounds began to question whether Hogwarts would provide the welcoming and supportive environment that had been promised, while established magical families started to wonder whether the school's commitment to excellence was being compromised by political disputes among its leadership. Educational institutions throughout Europe that had previously sought to collaborate with Hogwarts on research projects and student exchanges began to distance themselves from association with a school that appeared to be abandoning its founding principles in favor of divisive ideologies that contradicted widely accepted standards of ethical magical practice. The international reputation that had been built through years of innovative educational approaches and successful graduate outcomes was being undermined by internal conflicts that made the school appear unstable and unreliable as a partner in long-term collaborative endeavors. Perhaps most troubling from Helga's perspective was the impact of these conflicts on the students themselves, particularly those who had come to Hogwarts seeking refuge from persecution and discrimination in their home communities. Young witches and wizards who had hoped that magical education would provide them with opportunities to develop their abilities and find acceptance among people who shared their gifts, instead found themselves confronting the same prejudices and exclusions that had driven them to seek education away from home. The psychological toll on these students was evident in declining academic performance, increased requests for transfers to other schools, and growing reports of conflicts between students that reflected the divisions among their teachers. The sense of community and mutual support that had been one of Hogwarts' greatest achievements was being eroded by suspicions and resentments that made collaborative learning increasingly difficult to achieve. Helga's attempts to counteract these negative trends through expanded support services and additional programs designed to build cross-house relationships were meeting with limited success as the fundamental source of the place's HMD. Problems lay in policy decisions and leadership attitudes that were beyond her individual authority to change. The initiatives she developed to promote understanding and cooperation between students from different backgrounds were undermined by contrary messages from other faculty members and administrative policies that seemed to validate exactly the kind of discrimination she was working to overcome. The golden cup that had guided her throughout her journey and supported her work at Hogwarts began to respond to these conflicts in ways that reflected the artifact's deep connection to principles of justice and harmony. The cup grew noticeably cooler when she was forced to participate in meetings where discriminatory policies were being discussed, while its usual warm presence became muted during interactions with colleagues whose attitudes toward magical creatures and non-pure blood students violated the ethical principles that the cup embodied. More significantly, the cup's influence on the school's overall magical atmosphere began to waver as the conflicts among the founders created dissonance that interfered with its ability to promote harmony and mutual understanding throughout the BOC Castle community. The subtle magic that had previously helped students and faculty work together despite their differences was being overwhelmed by the intensity of philosophical disagreements that could not be resolved through magical intervention alone. The seasonal cycles that had previously brought natural renewal and fresh energy to the school's educational programs were disrupted by the ongoing tensions that made long-term planning and collaborative projects increasingly difficult to sustain. Faculty members who had once worked together on innovative curriculum development found themselves unable to agree on basic educational goals, while student organizations that had bridged house boundaries began to fragment along lines that reflected the deeper divisions within the school's leadership. Administrative functions that had previously operated smoothly through informal cooperation and shared commitment to the school's mission became sources of conflict as different founders interpreted policies and procedures according to their own philosophical frameworks. Disciplinary decisions that should have been based on clear behavioral standards became political statements about the relative worth of different categories of students, while resource allocation reflected priorities that seemed to favor some houses and constituencies over others. The most serious of these administrative conflicts involved the treatment of magical creatures who lived on the school grounds or in the surrounding forest, as Salazar's growing hostility toward non-human magical beings created safety and ethical issues that affected the entire school community. His insistence that dangerous creatures should be eliminated rather than studied or managed through protective measures put him in direct conflict with educational programs that relied on hands-on interaction with magical wildlife for practical learning experiences. These disputes about magical creature policy revealed fundamental differences about the nature of magical education and its relationship to the broader magical ecosystem that surrounded Hogwarts. Helga's position that students needed to understand and respect all forms of magical life as part of their comprehensive education was directly contradicted by Salazar's view that magical creatures existed primarily as resources, to be exploited or obstacles to be eliminated according to human convenience and safety considerations. The practical consequences of these philosophical differences affected every aspect of the school's relationship with its natural environment, from the management of the Forbidden Forest to the care of magical creatures that were used in educational programs. Students who had come to Hogwarts expecting to learn advanced techniques for working with magical animals found their educational opportunities limited by policies that reflected fear and hostility rather than scientific curiosity and ethical responsibility. But perhaps the most troubling aspect of these escalating conflicts was their impact on the personal relationships between the founders themselves. Friendships that had been forged through years of shared challenges and mutual support, but were increasingly strained by irreconcilable differences about fundamental questions of justice and moral responsibility. The easy camaraderie that had once characterized their interactions gave way to formal politeness that barely concealed growing animosity and distrust. Helga found herself caught between her loyalty to old friends and her commitment to principles that she could not compromise without betraying everything she had worked to achieve at Hogwarts. The conversations that had once been sources of intellectual stimulation and collaborative creativity became exercises in diplomatic damage control. As she attempted to find ways to address practical problems without triggering the kind of confrontations that could end their partnership permanently. The weight of these conflicts was taking a physical and emotional toll that affected her teaching and administrative effectiveness in ways that concerned colleagues and students who depended on her leadership and support. The patient optimism that had always characterized her approach to difficult problems was being tested by situations that seemed to offer no solutions that could satisfy competing demands for justice and loyalty, principle and pragmatism. As winter approached and the castle prepared for the seasonal celebrations that had traditionally brought the school community together in shared joy and mutual appreciation, the prospects for reconciling the growing divisions seemed dimmer than ever. The traditions that Helga had helped establish to promote unity and cooperation were being undermined by attitudes and policies that made genuine fellowship increasingly difficult to achieve. The Golden Cup's influence, which had once helped bridge differences and promote understanding between people with contrasting perspectives, was proving insufficient to overcome conflicts that had roots in fundamental disagreements about the nature of human worth and the proper use of magical power. The gentle magic that had supported harmonious relationships for years was being overwhelmed by forces that required more direct and decisive intervention than the cup's subtle influence could provide. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would test every principle that Helga held dear and force her to choose between preserving relationships that had defined her adult life and defending values that had guided her since childhood. The golden age of collaborative achievement at Hogwarts was drawing to a close, though none of the founders yet realized that their differences had become too profound to be resolved through the diplomatic approaches that had previously maintained their unity. The approaching crisis would require choices that would define not just their individual legacies but the future character of magical education throughout Britain and beyond. The gentle philosophy of inclusion and mutual respect that Helga represented would soon face its greatest test, and the outcome would determine whether Hogwarts would fulfill its original promise as a place where all magical people could find education and acceptance, or whether it would become yet another institution that perpetuated the divisions and prejudices that had always plagued wizarding society. The winter of discord had settled over Hogwarts like a curse that penetrated even the warmest chambers, carrying with it the bitter chill of irreconcilable differences that no amount of magical heating could dispel. The castle that had once resonated with the harmonious voices of collaboration now echoed with the sharp edges of conflict. As conversations that should have been collaborative planning sessions devolved into confrontations that left all participants exhausted and no closer to resolution than when they had begun. The breaking point came not through any single dramatic incident but through the accumulation of smaller betrayals and compromises that had eroded trust beyond the possibility of repair. Salazar Slytherin's positions on blood, purity, and magical creature rights had hardened into an ideology that brooked no dissent and accepted no compromise, while his treatment of students and staff who disagreed with his views had become increasingly punitive and vindictive. The final confrontation began, as such things often do, with what appeared to be a routine administrative meeting called to address concerns about student safety in the wake of several incidents involving magical creatures in the Forbidden Forest. What should have been a straightforward discussion of protective measures and educational policies instead became the forum where years of suppressed disagreements finally erupted into open conflict that could no longer be contained within the bounds of collegial discourse. Salazar's opening position, was that the forest should be cleared of all dangerous creatures through whatever means proved necessary, with the areas closest to the castle being converted into controlled environments where only harmless species would be permitted to remain. Students would be forbidden from entering the deeper regions of the forest under any circumstances, while educational programs that required interaction with potentially dangerous magical creatures would be eliminated entirely from the curriculum. Helga's response was immediate and uncompromising. The Forbidden Forest was not merely a convenient wilderness adjacent to the school, but an integral part of the educational environment that provided opportunities for learning that could not be replicated in any controlled setting. The magical creatures that lived there were not obstacles to be eliminated, but partners in the educational process whose presence enhanced rather than threatened the school's mission. More fundamentally, the approach that Salazar advocated represented exactly the kind of relationship between wizards and the natural world that magical education should work to overcome rather than reinforce. Students who learn to view magical creatures as threats to be eliminated or resources to be exploited would carry those attitudes into their adult lives, perpetuating patterns of domination and destruction that had already caused immense damage to magical ecosystems throughout Europe. The philosophical divide that this discussion revealed went far beyond questions of forest management to encompass fundamental disagreements about the purpose of magical education and the values that should guide the development of young B3 forest. Magical practitioners. Salazar's vision of magical education emphasized the supremacy of wizardkind over all other forms of magical life, with students learning to use their abilities primarily to advance their own interests and maintain their dominance over creatures and individuals who possessed less magical power. Helga's alternative vision stressed cooperation and mutual respect between all forms of magical life, with students learning to use their abilities in service of the common good and in harmony with the natural systems that sustained all magical existence. These were not merely different approaches to the same goals, but fundamentally incompatible worldviews that could not coexist within a single educational institution without creating contradictions that would ultimately undermine both approaches. The discovery of the Chamber of Secrets came not through deliberate investigation, but through the kind of accident that reveals truths that were meant to remain hidden. A house elf working on routine maintenance in the castle's lower levels reported strange sounds and unusual magical emanations coming from areas that should have been empty storage chambers. When Helga and Godric investigated these reports, they found evidence of recent construction work that none of the founders had authorized or even been informed about. The chamber itself was a masterpiece of magical architecture and engineering, clearly the work of someone with advanced knowledge of both structural magic and creature habitats. Its design incorporated elements that would allow it to remain hidden from casual observation, while providing a controlled environment where dangerous magical creatures could be housed and potentially bred for purposes that the Fergus Chamber's creator had not seen fit to discuss with his colleagues. But the most troubling aspect of the chamber was not its existence, but the nature of the creature that had been placed within it. The basilisk that dwelt in the hidden depths below the castle was not merely a dangerous predator, but a weapon that could be controlled only by someone who possessed the rare ability to communicate with serpents. Its presence at Hogwarts could serve no educational purpose, and represented a threat to the safety of students and staff that was completely inconsistent with the school's mission of providing a secure environment for magical learning. The confrontation that followed this discovery stripped away the last pretenses of collegial respect and revealed the depth of the betrayal that Salazar's secret project represented. He had used his position as a founder to construct a hidden weapon system within the school itself, creating capabilities for violence and intimidation that could be deployed against anyone who opposed his vision of what magical education should become. His justification for these actions was that the school faced threats from students and faculty members who were not truly committed to maintaining the standards of excellence that magical education required. The basilisk was not intended as an offensive weapon, but as a deterrent that would ensure compliance with policies designed to preserve the school's mission from contamination by those who lacked the proper qualifications or commitment to serve the magical community effectively. But beneath this rationalization lay attitudes that made continued collaboration impossible. Salazar's definition of who belonged at Hogwarts had narrowed to include only those students who met his evolving standards of blood purity and ideological conformity, while his concept of appropriate educational methods had expanded to include intimidation and the threat of lethal force against those who disagreed with his positions. The other three founders faced a choice that none of them had wanted to confront but could no longer avoid. They could accept Salazar's vision and allow Hogwarts to become an institution that served only a narrow segment of the magical community while using violence to suppress dissent and maintain ideological purity. Or they could stand by their original principles and accept the division of their partnership that such a stand would inevitably require. Helga's position was clear and unwavering. The presence of the basilisk represented a fundamental violation of everything Hogwarts was meant to represent, while Salazar's willingness to create such a threat without consulting his colleagues demonstrated a level of duplicity that made future collaboration impossible. The school could not fulfill its educational mission while harboring weapons that could be used to terrorize students and staff who failed to meet arbitrary standards of acceptability. Godric's response was more conflicted, as his friendship with Salazar warred with his recognition that the other founders' actions had crossed lines that could not be uncrossed. His warrior's instincts understood the logic of maintaining defensive capabilities against potential threats, but his moral sense rejected the use of such capabilities against the very students the school was meant to protect and educate. Rowena approached the crisis from a more analytical perspective, seeking to understand the underlying causes of Salazar's behavior while exploring possible solutions that might preserve the collaborative relationship that had made their joint achievements possible. But her efforts at rational mediation were frustrated by the emotional intensity of the conflict and the practical impossibility of finding compromises that could satisfy such fundamentally different visions of what the school should become. The decision to ask Salazar to leave was not made lightly or quickly, but emerged from a series of conversations where the other three founders gradually recognized that their former colleague had moved beyond positions that could be accommodated within their shared vision of magical education. His insistence on maintaining the basilisk and his threats to use it against students who failed to meet his standards made it impossible to guarantee the safety and welfare of the school community while he remained in a position of authority. The formal request that he resign his position as a founder and remove himself from the school was delivered with the regret and sadness that comes from the end of relationships that had once been sources of mutual support and creative collaboration. But it was also delivered with the firmness that comes from recognition that some principles are too important to compromise and some behaviors are too destructive to tolerate, regardless of past friendship or shared achievements. Salazar's response was predictably angry and defiant, though beneath his outrage lay what might have been recognition that his positions had become untenable within the collaborative framework that had originally brought the founders together. His departure from Hogwarts was accomplished quickly and with minimal ceremony. As he gathered his personal possessions and made arrangements to relocate his private research projects to facilities where his approach to magical education could be implemented without interference from colleagues who lacked his vision and commitment. But his leaving was not without consequences that would affect Hogwarts for centuries to come. The Chamber of Secrets remained hidden within the castle's depths, sealed by magic that would respond only to his descendants or those who shared his particular abilities. The basilisk continued to dwell in its artificial habitat, a dormant threat that could be awakened by anyone who possessed the knowledge and motivation to do so. The students who had been drawn to Slytherin House by his charismatic leadership and promises of special advantages found themselves abandoned by their patron and uncertain about their place in the school community. Some chose to leave Hogwarts and seek education elsewhere, while others attempted to remain and prove that their association with Salazar did not define their own values and commitments. The remaining 3 founders faced the enormous challenge of rebuilding Hogwarts as a 3-house institution while addressing the practical and psychological damage that the crisis had inflicted on the school community. The idealistic vision that had originally brought them together had been tested by the harsh realities of ideological conflict and personal betrayal, but their commitment to the fundamental principles of comprehensive magical education remained strong enough to provide a foundation for reconstruction. Helga's role in this rebuilding process was crucial, as her approach to healing and reconciliation proved essential for addressing the trauma that the crisis had created throughout the school community. Students who had witnessed the conflicts between their teachers needed reassurance that the school remained committed to their welfare and education, while faculty members who had been forced to choose sides in disputes they had never wanted to be part of needed support and guidance in redefining their professional relationships. The practical challenges of operating a school designed for 4 houses with only 3 remaining founders required significant restructuring of administrative and educational systems. Responsibilities that had been distributed among 4 people now had to be managed by 3, while educational programs that had relied on Salazar's specialized knowledge needed to be either eliminated or redesigned to function without his contributions. But perhaps the most significant challenge was rebuilding the sense of trust and mutual respect that had made the founders' collaboration possible in the first place. The revelation that one of their number had been willing to deceive his colleagues and threaten students in pursuit of his ideological goals raised questions about the reliability of personal relationships and the possibility of genuine partnership in endeavors that required sustained cooperation over extended periods. Helga's response to these challenges drew upon the same principles that had guided her throughout her life: the understanding that healing required patience and consistent demonstration of trustworthy behavior, that rebuilding required focusing on shared values rather than past conflicts, and that moving forward required forgiveness without forgetting the lessons that painful experiences had taught. The creation of the Room of Requirement emerged from this period of rebuilding as perhaps Helga's greatest contribution to the school's long-term welfare and educational mission. Using magic that drew upon the power of the Golden Cup but extended far beyond what any individual artifact could accomplish, she created a space within the castle that could adapt itself to meet whatever needs arose within the school community. The room's magic was complex and subtle, responding not to spoken requests, but to genuine need and sincere intention. Students who required a quiet place for study would find a library perfectly suited to their research requirements, while those who needed space for physical exercise would discover a gymnasium equipped with whatever apparatus their activities demanded. Most importantly, students who needed emotional support or guidance would find an environment that promoted healing and reflection while providing access to whatever resources could help them work through their difficulties. The Room of Requirement represented more than simply another magical innovation. It was a physical manifestation of the philosophical principles that Helga believed should guide all magical education. The room's ability to provide exactly what was needed without judgment or restriction reflected her conviction that educational institutions should serve students rather than forcing students to conform to arbitrary institutional requirements. The magic that sustained the room drew upon the same sources that had always powered Helga's most important work: the understanding that true magical power came from service to others rather than domination over them, from cooperation with natural forces rather than attempts to control them, and from recognition that the greatest achievements were those that lifted up others rather than advancing personal interests. But the room also incorporated lessons learned from the painful crisis that had led to its creation. Its magic included protections against misuse by those who might seek to exploit its capabilities for harmful purposes, while its design ensured that it could not be turned into a weapon or used to threaten the safety of the school community. The process of rebuilding Hogwarts after Salazar's departure required not just administrative restructuring, but a fundamental recommitment to the values and principles that had originally inspired the school's creation. The three remaining founders needed to articulate more clearly than ever before what they stood for and what they hoped to achieve through their educational efforts. Helga's contributions to this recommitment process drew upon her deep understanding of the ethical foundations that should guide all magical practice. She helped develop statements of purpose and codes of conduct that made explicit the school's commitment to serving all students regardless of their backgrounds, while also establishing procedures for addressing conflicts and disagreements in ways that preserved the collaborative relationships essential for effective education. The healing process extended beyond the immediate school community to encompass relationships with the broader magical world that had been damaged by reports of conflicts and divisions among the founders. Parents who had sent their children to Hogwarts based on its reputation for inclusive and comprehensive education needed reassurance that the school remained committed to those principles, despite the departure of one of its founders. Educational institutions throughout Europe that had established collaborative relationships with Hogwarts needed to understand what changes the crisis had created in the school's capabilities and priorities. Research projects that had involved Salazar's specialized knowledge needed to be evaluated and potentially redesigned to function without his contributions, while new partnerships needed to be developed to replace the connections that his departure had severed. The diplomatic challenges of managing these external relationships while simultaneously addressing internal reconstruction required skills and resources that stretched the remaining founders to their limits. But their commitment to transparency and honest communication helped maintain the trust and respect that made continued collaboration possible with partners who understood the difficult choices that principle had sometimes required. The long-term impact of the crisis and its resolution would be felt at Hogwarts for centuries to come, as the school community learned to function with the understanding that even the closest partnerships could be threatened by irreconcilable differences about fundamental values. But the successful navigation of this crisis also demonstrated that institutions built on solid ethical foundations could survive such challenges and emerge stronger than before. The golden cup that had guided Helga throughout her journey continued to play a subtle but important role in the healing and rebuilding process, its influence helping to restore the harmony and mutual respect that made collaborative education possible. The cup's magic worked to smooth over minor conflicts before they could escalate into major disputes, while encouraging all members of the school community to focus on their shared commitment to learning and growth rather than the differences that might divide them. But perhaps the cup's most important contribution during this difficult period was its validation of the choices that had been made in response to the crisis. The artifact's warmth and responsiveness confirmed that the decision to uphold principles of inclusion and ethical behavior, even at the cost of painful division, had been consistent with the deepest values that magical education should embody. The school that emerged from this crisis was different from the one that had existed during the golden age of four-founder collaboration, but it was also stronger in its commitment to the principles that would guide magical education for 1,000 years to come. The painful lessons learned through conflict and separation had clarified what was truly essential and what could be sacrificed when circumstances required difficult choices. Helga's leadership during this period of trial and reconstruction established her as more than simply one of four founders, but as a moral center whose commitment to ethical principles provided stability and guidance when others might be kiss, have been tempted by easier paths that required fewer sacrifices. The gentle strength that had always characterized her approach to magical practice proved essential for navigating challenges that required both firmness in principle and flexibility in method. The rebuilding of Hogwarts as a three-house institution would prove successful beyond anything the remaining founders had dared hope during the darkest moments of the crisis. The school would continue to grow and thrive, attracting students from throughout the magical world and establishing educational standards that would influence magical practice for generations to come. But perhaps most importantly, it would remain true to the vision of inclusive and comprehensive magical education that had inspired its creation, proving that some ideals are strong enough to survive even the most severe tests that reality can provide. The decades that followed the Great Schism and Salazar's departure from Hogwarts were marked not by the dramatic upheavals that had characterized the school's earlier crisis, but by the quieter rhythms of steady growth and deepening tradition that would define Helga Hufflepuff's lasting legacy. In the chambers beneath the castle, where she had established her house's common room, the honey-colored wood grew warmer with each passing year, seasoned by the laughter and tears of countless students who found in Hufflepuff a home that welcomed them regardless of the circumstances that had brought them to magical education. The daily routines that Helga had established during the school's founding years evolved into sacred rituals that connected each new generation of students to the values and principles that had guided their predecessors. The morning meal became a celebration of community, where students from all three remaining houses gathered to share food that was prepared not merely for nourishment, but as an expression of care and welcome that reminded everyone present of their place in the larger family that Hogwarts had become. Helga's teaching methods during these mature years reflected a depth of wisdom that could only come from decades of working with young people whose magical abilities were matched by the complexity of their emotional and intellectual development. She had learned to recognize the subtle signs that marked students who needed additional support, whether that need arose from academic challenges, personal difficulties, or the simple bewilderment that came from discovering abilities that defied every assumption they had previously held about the nature of reality itself. Her classroom became a refuge where students could explore the deeper implications of magical practice without fear of judgment or ridicule from peers who might not understand their questions or concerns. The lessons she taught went far beyond the technical aspects of spellcasting and potion brewing to encompass the philosophical foundations that should guide every decision about when and how to use magical abilities in service of worthy goals. The advanced courses that she developed for older students attracted young witches and wizards from throughout Britain and continental Europe, who came to Hogwarts specifically to study approaches to magic that were not available anywhere else in the educational world. These classes emphasized the integration of different magical disciplines in ways that created synergistic effects far more powerful than any single technique could achieve alone. Students learned to combine herbology with healing magic, domestic enchantments with protective charms, and creature communication with environmental management in comprehensive approaches that addressed complex problems requiring sustained effort over extended periods. The most advanced practitioners developed what Helga called ecosystem magic, the ability to work with entire magical environments as unified systems rather than collections of separate elements that could be manipulated independently. These teaching innovations established Hogwarts as the leading center for what would later be recognized as conservation magic, attracting researchers and practitioners who were concerned about the environmental damage being caused throughout Europe by irresponsible magical practices. Helga's students became leaders in efforts to restore magical habitats that had been damaged by warfare or exploitation, while developing new techniques for sustainable magical practice that could meet human needs without compromising the long-term health of magical ecosystems. The greenhouse complexes that she had originally established to support basic educational needs grew into vast botanical research centers that contained the most comprehensive collections of magical plants in the known world. These facilities served not only as educational resources for Hogwarts students, but as repositories of genetic diversity that preserved species and varieties that might otherwise have been lost to habitat destruction or climate change. The most ambitious of her botanical projects during this period was the creation of seed vaults that could preserve the genetic heritage of magical plants, even if their natural habitats were completely destroyed. These vaults incorporated preservation magic that could maintain viable seeds for centuries while protecting them from the magical degradation that normally affected biological materials removed from their natural environments. The success of these preservation efforts led to collaborations with magical communities throughout Europe and beyond. As her students and colleagues worked to document and protect magical biodiversity in regions that were threatened by political conflicts or environmental changes. The network of botanical researchers that developed around these projects became one of the most important international collaborations of the medieval period, transcending political boundaries and cultural differences in service of shared conservation goals. But perhaps Helga's most important contribution during these later years was her work in developing what she called succession magic, techniques for ensuring that knowledge and traditions could be passed from one generation to the next without loss of essential content or understanding. This work was motivated by her recognition that magical communities were vulnerable to disruption from external threats that could destroy accumulated wisdom if it existed only in the memories of living practitioners. The methods she developed went far beyond simple written records to encompass comprehensive approaches to knowledge preservation that included practical demonstrations, experiential learning, and the creation of magical artifacts that could serve as teaching tools for future generations. These techniques ensured that essential knowledge would survive even if the communities that had created it were disrupted or destroyed by warfare, persecution, or natural disasters. Her most sophisticated application of succession magic was the training program she established for the witches and wizards who would eventually succeed her as heads of Hufflepuff House. This program went far beyond administrative preparation to encompass deep understanding of the philosophical principles that guided Hufflepuff education, practical experience in the specialized techniques that characterized the house's approach to magical practice, and personal development that prepared future leaders for the emotional and spiritual challenges of serving as guides and mentors for young people discovering their magical heritage. The selection of her eventual successor was accomplished through processes that reflected her understanding that leadership in magical education required not just technical competence but wisdom, patience, and genuine commitment to serving others rather than advancing personal ambitions. The candidates who emerged from her training program were evaluated not on their ability to demonstrate impressive magical techniques, but on their capacity for creating environments where students could thrive and develop to their fullest potential. The golden cup that had guided her throughout her journey from orphaned child to legendary educator continued to play a central role in these succession preparations, though its influence became even more subtle and integrated into the daily operations of Hufflepuff House. The cup's magic helped identify students who possessed the character traits and abilities that marked them as potential future leaders, while also providing guidance about the timing and methods that would be most effective for their development. During these mature years, the cup's influence on the broader Hogwarts community deepened and became more comprehensive, creating an atmosphere of mutual support and collaborative learning that transcended house boundaries and connected all members of the school community in shared commitment to educational excellence and ethical behavior. The cup's magic worked to prevent the kind of factional conflicts that had characterized the crisis with Salazar, encouraging people to focus on their common goals rather than the differences that might otherwise divide them. The dining hall remained the physical center of this community-building magic, as the meals prepared under the cup's influence continued to provide not just physical nourishment but emotional sustenance that helped students and faculty maintain the energy and optimism needed for the challenging work of magical BV education. The recipes that Helga developed during this period incorporated increasingly sophisticated applications of nutritional magic, creating dishes that could support specific aspects of magical development, while providing therapeutic benefits for students who were struggling with health problems or emotional difficulties. The house elves who worked in the kitchens under her guidance became master practitioners of domestic magic whose skills rivaled those of any wizard or witch in specialized areas of household enchantment. The collaborative relationships she had established with them served as models for ethical interactions between magical species that influenced attitudes and practices throughout the wizarding world. Her advocacy for house elf rights and welfare led to the development of legal frameworks that provided protections for magical creatures who worked in wizarding households, while also creating opportunities for professional development that allowed them to advance their skills and take on responsibilities that had previously been reserved for wizards and witches. These innovations in interspecies relations became another area where Hogwarts led the way in establishing more ethical approaches to magical practice. The students who graduated from Hufflepuff House during these years carried with them not just magical skills and theoretical knowledge, but practical experience in building inclusive communities and working collaboratively with people from diverse backgrounds and traditions. They became leaders in efforts to bridge divides between different magical communities, while also serving as advocates for ethical magical practices in their chosen careers and communities. Many of these graduates went on to establish their own schools and training programs that were based on the principles and methods they had learned during their years at Hogwarts. The network of educational institutions that developed around these efforts extended Helga's influence far beyond the boundaries of Scotland, creating opportunities for magical education that might not otherwise have existed in regions where traditional approaches to magical training were inadequate or unavailable. The international reputation that Hufflepuff House developed during this period attracted students from increasingly distant regions, as word spread of educational approaches that combined practical effectiveness with ethical foundations and genuine concern for student welfare. The house became particularly known as a destination for students who had experienced trauma or displacement, as Helga's therapeutic approaches to magical education proved especially effective for young people who needed healing as well as instruction. The healing techniques that she developed during her work with traumatized students became another area of innovation that influenced magical medical practice throughout Europe and beyond. Her understanding of how emotional distress could affect magical abilities, combined with her knowledge of nutritional magic and environmental factors that supported recovery, created new possibilities for treating conditions that had previously been considered incurable. The most sophisticated of these therapeutic approaches involved creating individualized treatment environments that could provide exactly the combination of magical, emotional, and physical support that each student needed for optimal recovery and development. These treatments required enormous amounts of time and resources, but they achieved success rates that exceeded anything previously documented in magical medical literature. The research that emerged from this therapeutic work contributed to broader understanding of the connections between physical health, emotional well-being, and magical ability that would influence magical medical practice for centuries to come. Helga's students who went on to careers in magical healing carried with them comprehensive approaches to treatment that addressed root causes rather than merely managing symptoms. As her physical strength began to decline with advancing age, Helga gradually transferred many of her daily responsibilities to younger colleagues while retaining her role as philosophical guide and final authority on matters that affected the fundamental character of Hufflepuff House and its place within the larger Hogwarts community. This transition was managed with characteristic patience and wisdom, ensuring that essential knowledge and traditions would be preserved while allowing new leadership to develop their own approaches to the challenges of their time. The ceremonies that marked her gradual retirement from active teaching were celebrations of a life dedicated to service rather than formal acknowledgements of professional achievement. Students and colleagues from throughout her career gathered to share stories and memories that revealed the depth and breadth of her influence on the magical education community, while also expressing gratitude for lessons learned and relationships formed under her guidance. The final years of her active involvement in Hogwarts administration were focused on ensuring that the Room of Requirement would continue to serve the school community long after her death, as she worked with the castle's other magical systems to integrate the room's capabilities more fully into the educational environment. The room's magic was enhanced and expanded during this period, developing new capabilities that reflected her growing understanding of what students and faculty needed most for optimal learning and personal development. Her preparation of the Golden Cup for its eventual separation from her direct stewardship involved magic that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible in artifact enchantment. The cup needed to retain its essential capabilities while becoming responsive to future guardians who would lack her intimate understanding of its nature and potential applications. The enchantments she wove during this process ensured that the cup would continue to serve the values and principles that had guided its use throughout her lifetime, while adapting to changing circumstances and evolving needs. The protective measures that she established around the cup during these final preparations reflected hard-won understanding of how powerful magical artifacts could be corrupted or misused by those who lacked proper training or ethical foundations. The cup's magic was designed to resist attempts at exploitation while remaining available to serve legitimate educational and healing purposes under the guidance of worthy successors. The passing of Helga Hufflepuff came peacefully in her sleep during a quiet spring morning when the castle grounds were alive with the sounds of students enjoying the warming weather and the promise of approaching summer holidays. Her death was not unexpected, as she had been gradually declining in health for several months, but the sense of loss that swept through the Hogwarts community reflected the profound impact that her life and work had made on everyone who had been privileged to know her. The memorial services that honored her life and achievements drew attendees from throughout the magical world, as former students, colleagues, and collaborators gathered to pay their respects to someone whose influence had extended far beyond the boundaries of any single institution or community. The eulogies that were delivered emphasized not her magical innovations or educational achievements, but her character and the example she had provided of how magical abilities could be used in service of others. The Golden Cup that had been her constant companion throughout her adult life was placed in the care of her chosen successor, though not before additional protective enchantments were added to ensure that it would never be used for purposes that contradicted the values it represented. These protections would prove prescient in later centuries when the cup would face threats that its original enchantments alone might not have been sufficient to resist. The traditions that she had established at Hogwarts continued to flourish under new leadership that had been carefully prepared to maintain continuity with her approaches while adapting to changing circumstances and evolving needs. The dining hall continued to serve meals that combined physical nourishment with emotional sustenance, while the greenhouse complexes expanded their research programs and conservation efforts under the guidance of botanists who had been trained in her methods. The Room of Requirement became a permanent memorial to her vision of education that could adapt to meet whatever needs arose within the school community, providing resources and support that helped countless students overcome challenges and achieve their potential. The room's magic continued to reflect her understanding that the most important educational innovations were those that served students rather than advancing institutional prestige or administrative convenience. The international network of educational institutions that had developed around her innovations continued to expand and evolve, spreading approaches to magical education that emphasized ethical foundations and comprehensive development rather than simple technical training. These schools became centers of learning that attracted students from throughout the magical world, while also serving as resources for their local communities. The healing techniques and therapeutic approaches that she had pioneered continued to influence magical medical practice long after her death. As practitioners who had learned her methods developed new applications and refinements that extended their effectiveness to conditions and situations that she had never encountered. The integration of nutritional magic, environmental factors, and emotional support that characterized her approach became standard practice in magical healing institutions throughout Europe and beyond. But perhaps her most enduring legacy lay in the countless individuals whose lives had been transformed by their experiences as her students, colleagues, or collaborators. These people carried forward not just her techniques and knowledge, but her values and her example of how magical abilities could be used to serve purposes larger than personal advancement or achievement. The stories that were told about her in the years following her death gradually evolved into legends that emphasized her gentleness and wisdom, while sometimes overlooking the strength and determination that had been necessary for her achievements. But those who had known her personally understood that her gentle approach to education and healing had been backed by unwavering commitment to principles that she was prepared to defend against any challenge or opposition. The influence of her work continued to expand through the activities of former students who established their own schools, healing centers, and research institutions based on the principles and methods they had learned during their time at Hogwarts. This network of affiliated institutions created opportunities for magical education and healing that extended her reach far beyond what any single person could have achieved through individual effort. The botanical research programs that she had initiated continued to document and preserve magical plant species throughout Europe and beyond, while also developing new applications for conservation magic that helped restore damaged magical ecosystems. The seed vaults that she had established became models for similar preservation efforts in other regions, creating a global network of genetic repositories that would prove essential for maintaining magical biodiversity through periods of environmental and political upheaval. The ethical frameworks that she had developed for interactions between wizards and other magical species continued to influence legal and social policies long after her death. As magical communities gradually adopted more respectful approaches to interspecies relations, the collaborative relationships she had established with house elves, centaurs, and other magical beings provided examples that challenged traditional assumptions about the proper hierarchies and power relationships within magical society. The Room of Requirement remained as her greatest architectural legacy, a space that embodied her understanding that education should serve students rather than forcing students to conform to institutional limitations. The room's continued availability to provide whatever was most needed in any situation ensured that her vision of adaptive, responsive education would continue to influence Hogwarts long after the specific programs and policies of her era had been modified or replaced. The Golden Cup's influence continued to permeate the daily life of Hufflepuff House and the broader Hogwarts community, though its magic became so thoroughly integrated into the castle's other enchantments that few people recognized its presence or understood its role in maintaining the atmosphere of mutual support and collaborative learning that characterized the school. The Cup's subtle influence helped prevent the kind of factional conflicts that might otherwise have developed as the school grew and diversified, while encouraging the kind of inclusive community that made comprehensive magical education possible for students from widely varying backgrounds and traditions. The centuries that flowed like gentle streams through the Scottish Highlands witnessed the gradual transformation of Helga Hufflepuff's legacy from living memory into enduring legend. As each successive generation of witches and wizards discovered anew the profound truths embedded in her approach to magical education and ethical practice, The values she had championed during her lifetime, loyalty, dedication, fairness, and inclusion, became not merely historical curiosities but living principles that continued to shape the development of magical society long after her personal influence had passed into the realm of cherished memory. The most remarkable aspect of Hufflepuff's continuing influence was how naturally her philosophy adapted to changing circumstances while retaining its essential character and moral foundation. As the magical world evolved through periods of conflict and peace, technological innovation, and social transformation, the principles she had established proved flexible enough to address new challenges while remaining true to their fundamental commitment to serving the common good rather than advancing narrow interests or factional advantages. The house that bore her name became renowned throughout the wizarding world, not for producing the most powerful wizards or the most brilliant theorists, but for graduating individuals whose character and dedication made them indispensable members of their communities, regardless of the specific careers they chose to pursue. Hufflepuff alumni became the backbone of magical society, the healers who worked tirelessly during epidemics, the teachers who ensured that magical knowledge passed safely from one generation to the next, the administrators who maintained the institutions that allowed magical communities to function effectively despite the countless challenges they faced. One of the most celebrated Hufflepuffs of the early medieval period was Brother Aldrich the Healer, whose work during the Great Magical Plague of the 13th century demonstrated the practical application of Helga's integrated approach to magical medicine. When conventional healing methods proved inadequate against a malady that seemed to attack both physical health and magical ability simultaneously, Aldrich developed treatment protocols that combined nutritional magic, environmental therapy, and community support in ways that addressed the disease's complex effects on multiple levels. His success in treating patients who had been given up for lost by other healers established new standards for magical medical practice that emphasized comprehensive care rather than simple symptom management. More importantly, his insistence on treating patients from all social backgrounds without regard to their ability to pay established ethical precedents that influenced magical medical practice for centuries to come. The healing centers that he founded throughout Britain were organized according to principles that Helga would have immediately recognized, creating environments where patients could recover not just their health, but their confidence and sense of place within the magical community. The agricultural innovations developed by Hufflepuff graduates during the late medieval period demonstrated another practical application of Helga's ecological approach to magic. As magical communities faced increasing pressure from growing non-magical populations and changing climate patterns, traditional farming methods proved inadequate to meet the food security needs of wizarding families who could no longer rely on isolation and concealment to protect their way of life. Wizards like Godwin Earthsong and Millicent Rootweaver developed techniques that combined conventional agriculture with magical enhancement in ways that dramatically increased crop yields while actually improving soil health and biodiversity rather than depleting natural resources. Their methods attracted attention from both magical and non-magical farming communities, creating opportunities for cooperation that helped bridge some of the growing tensions between the two populations. These agricultural innovations were based on the same philosophical foundations that had guided Helga's work at Hogwarts, the understanding that sustainable prosperity required working with natural systems rather than attempting to dominate or exploit them. The magical techniques they developed enhanced natural fertility and disease resistance rather than replacing them with artificial substitutes, while their crop management strategies emphasized diversity and resilience over simple maximization of short-term yields. The success of these approaches led to the establishment of agricultural research centers throughout Europe that were modeled on the greenhouse complexes that Helga had created at Hogwarts. These institutions became centers of innovation that influenced farming practices in both magical and non-magical communities. while also serving as diplomatic bridges that helped maintain peaceful relationships during periods when broader political tensions might otherwise have led to conflict. The development of magical creature conservation during the Renaissance period reflected another dimension of Hufflepuff influence that extended far beyond the boundaries of formal education. As human populations expanded and industrial activities began to encroach on traditional magical habitats, many species that had coexisted with wizarding communities for centuries found themselves threatened with extinction or forced displacement. Hufflepuff graduates like Newt Scamander's predecessor, Cornelius Beast's friend, developed comprehensive approaches to magical creature protection that combined habitat preservation with careful management of human-creature interactions. Their work established the theoretical and practical foundations for what would later become the formal discipline of magizoology, while also creating legal frameworks that provided protection for magical species that might otherwise have been lost to habitat destruction or hunting pressure. The success of these conservation efforts required exactly the kind of patient, collaborative approach that Helga had pioneered in her work with house elves and centaurs. Effective protection of magical creatures required understanding not just their biological needs, but their roles within magical ecosystems and their relationships with both wizarding and non-magical communities. The conservationists who emerged from Hufflepuff House possessed the diplomatic skills and ethical foundation needed to navigate these complex relationships while maintaining focus on their primary mission of species preservation. The establishment of magical creature reserves throughout Europe and beyond created networks of protected habitats that served multiple functions within magical society. These reserves provided safe spaces where threatened species could recover their populations while also serving as research centers where magical naturalists could study creature behavior and magical properties in natural settings. Most importantly, they became educational resources where young witches and wizards could learn to understand and respect the complex web of relationships that connected all forms of magical life. During the period of witch hunts and religious persecution that marked the early modern era, Hufflepuff House developed particular expertise in protection and concealment magic that proved essential for the survival of magical communities throughout Europe. The techniques that graduates developed went far beyond simple hiding spells to encompass comprehensive approaches to community security that could shield entire populations from detection while maintaining their traditional ways of life. The most sophisticated of these protection systems were based on the same principles of harmony and integration that had always characterized Hufflepuff magic. Rather than attempting to completely separate magical communities from their non-magical neighbors, these approaches created selective concealment that allowed for necessary interactions while hiding activities that might provoke persecution or conflict. Magical families could continue to participate in local economic and social life while keeping their true nature hidden from those who might react with fear or hostility. The psychological and social challenges of maintaining these dual identities required support systems that drew heavily on Hufflepuff traditions of community building and mutual care. Networks of safe houses, secure communication methods, and emergency evacuation procedures were established throughout regions where persecution was most severe, creating resources that helped magical families survive periods of intense danger while maintaining hope for eventual improvement in their circumstances. The healers and midwives who served these endangered communities often provided the only medical care available to both magical and non-magical families in remote areas where professional physicians were scarce or unavailable. Their ability to treat conditions that conventional medicine could not address made them valuable members of their communities despite the risks that their activities entailed. The careful balance they maintained between helping others and protecting their own safety demonstrated practical applications of the ethical frameworks that Helga had developed centuries earlier. The gradual emergence of more tolerant attitudes toward magical practice during the Enlightenment period created new opportunities for Hufflepuff graduates to contribute to broader social and intellectual developments without the need for complete concealment. Magical researchers began to collaborate more openly with non-magical scholars in areas where their different approaches to understanding natural phenomena could complement each other productively. The botanical research programs that had originated in Helga's greenhouse complexes provided foundations for advances in both magical and conventional medicine that benefited populations throughout Europe and beyond. Magical plants that had been carefully preserved and studied over centuries yielded insights into chemical compounds and biological processes that revolutionized understanding of how living systems functioned and how they could be influenced to promote health and prevent disease. These collaborative research efforts required diplomatic skills and cultural sensitivity that reflected the best traditions of Hufflepuff education. Magical researchers needed to share their knowledge in ways that could be understood and applied by non-magical colleagues while carefully concealing the magical processes that made certain discoveries possible. This balance between openness and discretion required exactly the kind of thoughtful approach to inter-community relations that had always been a hallmark of Hufflepuff training. The Industrial Revolution presented both unprecedented opportunities and serious challenges for magical communities that had traditionally relied on handicraft production and small-scale agriculture for their economic foundation. Hufflepuff graduates played crucial roles in helping magical families adapt to rapidly changing economic conditions while maintaining the values and traditions that defined their cultural identity. The magical innovations that emerged during this period demonstrated creative applications of traditional techniques to modern problems in ways that would have delighted Helga herself. Enchanted tools and processes that could enhance productivity without completely replacing human skill and creativity allowed magical craftspeople to compete with mass production while maintaining the quality and individuality that marked their work as special. These innovations help preserve traditional magical crafts while adapting them to serve new markets and meet evolving consumer needs. The transportation revolution that transformed the non-magical world during the 18th and 19th centuries created particular challenges for magical communities that had traditionally relied on methods like apparition and Bay v18th, magical creature transport for long-distance travel. The development of magical modifications to conventional transportation systems required careful engineering that could enhance speed and comfort without creating obvious supernatural effects that might attract unwanted attention. Hufflepuff graduates who specialized in transportation magic developed techniques that could make conventional vehicles more reliable and comfortable, while also providing subtle protections against accidents and mechanical failures. Their innovations helped magical families maintain their connections to distant communities while adapting to transportation systems that were increasingly dominated by non-magical technology and infrastructure. The establishment of formal magical governments during the modern period reflected another area where Hufflepuff influence proved essential for creating institutions that could serve diverse populations while maintaining legitimacy and effectiveness. The administrative skills and diplomatic experience that characterized Hufflepuff education made graduates particularly valuable for positions that required building consensus among groups with different interests and priorities. The legal frameworks that emerged from this period of institution building reflected ethical principles that Helga would have immediately recognized. Laws that protected the rights of magical creatures, regulations that ensured fair treatment of house elves, and judicial procedures that emphasized rehabilitation over punishment all showed the influence of educational approaches that had emphasized character development alongside technical training. The International Confederation of Wizards that was established during the 17th century included numerous Hufflepuff alumni in key positions that required maintaining peaceful relationships between magical communities with very different traditions and priorities. Their success in negotiating treaties and agreements that prevented conflicts while respecting cultural differences demonstrated practical applications of the inclusive philosophy that had always defined Hufflepuff House. The challenges posed by 2 world wars in the 20th century tested every aspect of magical society's resilience and adaptability. Hufflepuff graduates played crucial roles in maintaining essential services and supporting civilian populations during periods when conventional institutions were disrupted or destroyed by conflict. Their training in emergency response and community support proved invaluable for helping magical families survive wartime conditions while maintaining hope for eventual recovery and reconstruction. The healing centers and refugee assistance programs that were established during these conflicts drew heavily on techniques and organizational approaches that had been developed over centuries of Hufflepuff innovation. The ability to create supportive environments where traumatized individuals could begin to recover from their experiences reflected psychological insights that had been refined through generations of working with students and community members who had faced various forms of adversity and displacement. The reconstruction efforts that followed both world wars demonstrated the long-term value of educational approaches that emphasized service to others over personal advancement. Hufflepuff alumni were often among the first to volunteer for difficult and dangerous work that was necessary for rebuilding damaged communities. While their networks of personal and professional relationships provided resources for coordination and mutual support, that proved essential during periods when formal institutions were unreliable or unavailable. The development of modern magical education during the 20th century reflected ongoing influence from pedagogical innovations that could be traced directly back to Helga's original approaches to comprehensive student development. Educational institutions throughout the magical world adopted techniques that emphasized character development alongside technical training, recognizing that the most effective magical practitioners were those who possessed both skill and wisdom in applying their abilities responsibly. The expansion of magical education to include students from increasingly diverse backgrounds reflected another aspect of Hufflepuff legacy that proved remarkably prescient. As magical communities became more integrated with broader society, educational institutions needed to serve student populations that included individuals from cultural backgrounds that had not traditionally been represented in formal magical education. The inclusive approaches that Helga had pioneered proved essential for creating learning environments where all students could thrive regardless of their family histories or previous experiences. Professor Pomona Sprout's tenure as head of Hufflepuff House during the late 20th century demonstrated how traditional values could be adapted to address contemporary challenges while maintaining their essential character. Her leadership during the period surrounding Voldemort's return showed how the patient, collaborative approach that had always characterized Hufflepuff could be applied to situations that required both courage and strategic thinking under extreme pressure. The role that Hufflepuff students played during the Battle of Hogwarts reflected the practical outcomes of educational approaches that emphasized loyalty, dedication, and service to others over personal glory or advancement. While other houses might have produced more individually celebrated heroes, Hufflepuff provided the steady, reliable support that made victory possible through collective effort rather than individual achievement. The dark period during which Helga's Golden Cup was corrupted into a Horcrux represented perhaps the greatest threat that her legacy ever faced, as the artifact that had embodied her values for centuries was transformed into a vessel for the very evil she had spent her life opposing. The cup's eventual purification and restoration demonstrated the resilience of the principles it represented, proving that true ethical foundations could survive even the most severe corruption and emerge stronger than before. The process of cleansing the cup required exactly the kind of collaborative effort that Helga had always championed, as it could not be accomplished through individual heroism alone, but needed the combined efforts of many people working together toward a common goal. The restoration of the cup's original nature served as a powerful symbol of how communities could overcome even the most devastating damage when they remained committed to their fundamental values and willing to support each other. Through difficult times, the modern wizarding world that emerged from the conflicts of the 20th century bore the unmistakable influence of centuries of Hufflepuff contribution to magical society. Legal systems that protected the rights of all magical beings, educational institutions that served diverse populations, medical practices that emphasized comprehensive care, and conservation programs that preserved magical biodiversity all reflected approaches that could be traced back to principles that Helga had established during her lifetime. The continuing relevance of Hufflepuff values in contemporary magical society demonstrated their fundamental soundness as guides for ethical behavior and effective community building. In an era when magical and non-magical populations were becoming increasingly integrated, the diplomatic skills and inclusive attitudes that had always characterized Hufflepuff education proved essential for maintaining peaceful relationships and productive cooperation between different communities. The technological innovations that characterized the late 20th and early 21st centuries created new opportunities for applying traditional magical techniques to modern problems in ways that enhanced rather than replaced human capabilities. Hufflepuff graduates who specialized in integrating magical and technological approaches developed solutions to environmental problems, medical challenges, and social issues that neither magical nor technological methods could address effectively when used alone. The environmental movement that emerged during the late 20th century found natural allies among Hufflepuff alumni, whose training had always emphasized sustainable practices and respect for natural systems. Their expertise in conservation, magic, and ecological restoration became increasingly valuable as both magical and non-magical communities recognized the need for more responsible approaches to resource management and environmental protection. The global communication networks that developed during this period created opportunities for international cooperation that would have amazed earlier generations of magical practitioners. Hufflepuff graduates used these new capabilities to establish collaborative research programs, emergency response networks, and educational exchanges that extended their influence to regions and communities that had previously been isolated from broader magical society. The challenges posed by climate change and environmental degradation required exactly the kind of long-term, collaborative approach that had always been a hallmark of Hufflepuff philosophy. The solutions that emerged from this work demonstrated practical applications of ecological principles that Helga had understood intuitively, but that now could be supported by scientific research and implemented through coordinated international efforts. As the 21st century progressed, the values that Helga Hufflepuff had embodied during her lifetime proved more relevant than ever for addressing challenges that required cooperation across cultural, national, and species boundaries. The patient, inclusive approach that she had pioneered continued to provide effective frameworks for building the kind of trust and mutual understanding that made complex collaborative projects possible even under difficult circumstances. The legacy of Hufflepuff House in the modern era was measured not in dramatic achievements or celebrated innovations, but in the steady accumulation of positive changes that made life better for countless individuals and communities. Throughout the magical world, the graduates who carried forward her traditions might not have achieved individual fame or recognition, but their collective contributions created a foundation of ethical practice and community service that supported the entire structure of magical society. The continuing influence of the Golden Cup, now restored to its original purpose and safely protected within Hogwarts, served as a reminder that some values transcend the circumstances of their origin and remain valid guides for ethical behavior, regardless of how much the world around them might change. The cup's magic continued to support the kind of community building and mutual care that had always been the true measure of Hufflepuff's success, proving that some forms of magic become more powerful rather than less effective as they age and mature. The students who continued to be sorted into Hufflepuff House carried forward traditions that connected them to centuries of predecessors who had chosen service over self-interest, patience over immediate gratification, and inclusion over exclusion. Their diverse backgrounds and contemporary perspectives brought new insights and innovations to these traditional values while maintaining their essential commitment to using magical abilities for the benefit of others rather than purely personal advancement. The network of institutions, practices, and relationships that had grown from Helga's original vision represented one of the most enduring and influential legacies in the history of magical education and community development. From the greenhouse complexes at Hogwarts to conservation programs on distant continents, from healing centers in urban environments to agricultural research stations in rural communities, the practical applications of her philosophy continue to make positive differences in the lives of people who might never know the historical origins of the programs and services they benefited from. The true measure of Hufflepuff's continuing influence lay not in monuments or formal recognition, but in the daily choices made by countless individuals who had learned through education, example, or simple cultural transmission that the greatest magic was found not in dominating others, but in lifting them up, not in hoarding knowledge and resources, but in sharing them generously, and not in seeking glory for oneself, but in creating opportunities for others to achieve their own potential and contribute their own gifts to the common good. Rest now, dear friend, as our tale of the most gentle house draws to its peaceful close. In the quiet corners of your dreams, may you find the warmth that Helga Hufflepuff brought to those ancient castle halls, the comfort of a shared meal, the strength found in true friendship, the quiet satisfaction of work done with care and dedication. Her legacy lives on in every act of kindness, every moment of loyalty, every time someone chooses to include rather than exclude. As you drift towards slumber, remember that in a world that often celebrates the loud and the bold, there is profound magic in the patient and the kind. Sleep well, knowing that somewhere in the magical world, the badgers of Hufflepuff continue their quiet watch, tending their gardens and keeping their doors open for any who need shelter, friendship, or simply a warm meal shared in good company.